What's going on? This is the Saturday Down South podcast. I am Connor O'Gara. Will, you were away. You were on the West Coast. People didn't know that because you didn't miss any pods, but how was the West Coast?
It was amazing, man. It was exactly what I needed kind of in my personal life, in my kind of career journey, doing a lot more like freelance work these days and everything, and being around my stepdad and my stepbrother too, just like, good, like successful dudes. It's cool, man. I grew up as an only child, and I didn't really have a ton of like male role models and stuff growing up. And so I think being in a time, I don't know if I've officially said this in the pod, but I actually got laid off from my job, from my TV job. And so Friday was my last day officially, but I was on PTO so I could go on this trip. And it was great. I mean, you know how it goes. Like, we're grinders, we work a ton every day. We get a lot done in a day, and we work long hours. And so to go from that to just kind of like chilling was definitely an adjustment. But like I said, being around those dudes, being in the California redwoods, I mean, it was so beautiful out there. So it was exactly what I needed, man.
Sounds good, man. Sounds really good. Yeah, the West Coast trip, if you have the time, have the funds to make it happen, it's definitely a bucket list thing. We did that, 4 years ago? That was almost 4 years ago. That was right when everything opened up again post pandemic, and did a trip down the Pacific Coast Highway and started off in San Francisco, and absolutely loved it. And would love to be able to do it again someday. But glad that you're back. Glad that you're ready to roll with us. We have a great show coming up. Ryan McGee on the way. Awesome conversation with someone that had somehow never been on this show, even though Ryan and I have been friendly for a little while now. And honestly, and I was telling you this off air, he's probably the person that I look up to professionally the most. And I don't really throw that around lightly. I truly mean that. And I respect Ryan so much and what he's been able to do in this industry. So we will have that. And then we're going to end with Lad of the Week. But first, Will, the 10 worst contracts in college football.
Oh, heck yeah.
I thought we'd do something that is a little bit of a hat tip to Ryan, who, does the bottom 10 piece. And that has become a weekly staple in season on ESPN.com. We are ranking the 10 worst contracts in college football. And to be clear, this is college football coaches. I realize we are
not
about
Bryce Underwood.
Not Bryce Underwood. We will not get into whether or not Nico Iamaleava is worth the money that he got NIL wise. We are really close on the precipice of getting into college players having contracts that are out in the open. And it's very well known what a guy is making with his salary, but we are just going today we're going to focus on just the coaches. So I'm going to base a lot of this on the buyout. It's obviously an important part, because if you're in a bad contract, that means you're underachieving, and your team will probably end up having to pay a lot to be able to get you out of that deal. And the example that I'll always use for a good contract was what Dan Mullen got after year 3. He got a bump in base pay that made him one of the 5 highest paid coaches in the sport, but the buyout stayed at $12 million.
They put him on Klarna, brother. They had quad pay. They were like, you know what, Dan, we're not sure if this is going to work out, but we're going to pay you like it is until it doesn't. And boy, didn't it.
Yeah, look, and I still would stand by that contract.
It's a great I'm serious. That's a great contract.
I think Dan Mullen got what he wanted. I think Scott Strickland got what he wanted. And we know that raises and extensions in this sport so often come with an increased buyout. And that's a big part of this. The majority of the people that are on this list made the cut because at some point they were valued and they got an extension and a raise that bumped up their buyout. So I'm not saying that these coaches are all just horrendous coaches that have been largely overpaid. You don't get to that place in college football without having some level of success.
It's a mix of the like, we always talk about CEO pay, right? Because it's like a headhunting industry, right? So you're paid at your current job what you'd be worth somewhere else. And then on the other side of it, you remember the NBA when they had the new CBA, the new collective bargaining agreement, and gentlemen like Solomon Hill got paid, $60 million or whatever. That was a lot of money back then. But point being, it's timing on one side of it. And on the other side of it is not getting embarrassed and losing your guy because you want to nickel and dime him.
I should mention Bill Simmons doing his annual worst contracts in the NBA. He just did that, I think, a week ago. Also an inspiration. That hit the YouTube algorithm for me, and I probably processed that, and I'm now just remembering that I saw that, and that's why we have to do this idea today.
There you go.
I think that there's also a way to look at this while acknowledging that one can have a rich contract But if your buyout isn't that costly, you don't have a bad contract. For example, I don't think Hugh Freeze has a bad contract because Auburn this time was smart enough to learn from its mistakes with Gus, with Harsin, that instead of having all of this money due in the first 30 days, half of the buyout due in the first 30 days, you can spread it out and do monthly payments. And that's what they did with Hugh Freeze. And that is why he's not going to be on this list. You're not going to hear me bring up Hugh Freeze, despite the fact that a few weeks ago, I said he's got the hottest seat in the SEC. I stand by that. Doesn't mean that he necessarily has a bad contract. And to be clear, an 8-figure buyout is the standard. $12 million now in this sport for a buyout is the new standard. USA Today's database is what I'll be referencing for the vast majority of this show. Steve Berkowitz does a tremendous job putting this list together every single year, just like Bill Connolly's percentage of returning production. I bookmark it. I find myself always coming back to it. If you want to follow along today or come up with some answers of your own, I recommend pulling it up. It is a really, really good resource, and it answers a lot of questions. It does. Will, if you didn't look ahead at the notes that I've got prepared here, how many coaches last year would have had a buyout of at least $12 million if they had been fired?
Oh, man. So how many total jobs are there? I think it's 133 now. It kind of moves.
Yeah, I think it's up to 133. I think it was last year. We're going to be at, I think, 136 in FBS, which is pretty wild considering the days of 118. It wasn't that long ago that it felt like we had that many FBS programs. But yes, I believe 133. It's very close to that number.
I'm going to split that about in half. I'm going to say about 60 or 70 or at 12 million.
With a buyout.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, not quite. I thought you would go way under on that.
Okay.
46.
46. Okay, so I kind of got close then. Okay.
Yeah, that's close. I thought you were going to say like 20 or something. And I don't think it was that long ago where that would have been the case. And, you probably could have gone back pre-TV boom era, pre-playoff era, and found that numbers were a lot closer to that. And once upon a time, paying an 8-figure buyout to a head coach was like, wow, you really messed up. How in the world did you get yourself in that kind of a hole? But 46, according to the USA Today database, had a buyout of at least $12 million last year.
It's a massive arms race, too. Not to cut you off, but you're so right, because it was seen as, these are the top coaches in the league. They make this much money. They've deserved it. But now, like I said, it's to prevent poaching from other teams. And we're seeing teams get a little bit insecure about their place in this whole thing. Looking at the ACC teams in the Granted Rights deal we were just talking about, they're saying, hey, we want to pay you like a Big Ten team because a Big Ten team can come get you if you are – weird example now, but he's making a lot of money, Mike Norvell, right? And so point being,
not the last mention of Mike Norvell.
Right. I had a feeling we were going to see him, but that's why a guy like that makes so much money, because if you try to keep him cheap and he has a year like 2 years ago, he's gone, right?
And an important thing to mention here, I'm glad that you said the word poach, because as I always say, today I'm referencing whenever I say buyout, and moving forward, this is just going to be my policy. Whenever I say buyout, I am talking about how much money it would cost a school to fire that head coach and pay them to not work. If there is a poach fee, I will reference poach fee. What Alabama paid to be able to get Kalen DeBoer, what it would have cost Alabama to hire Dan Lanning from Oregon, $20 million, just in case you're curious. Dan Lanning also recently paid, doing well. Great.
It is one of Phil Knight's toenails.
Yeah. Look, it's 3 times as much as his predecessor was getting. So the guy's doing something right. But yeah, 28 of those 46 with buyouts of at least $12 million last year, they were either Big Ten or SEC coaches. Bring up, it's an arms race.
Yep.
Yeah, it reflects that. It really does. Only 6 Big Ten or SEC coaches didn't have 8-figure buyouts in the USA Today database, but it's actually even less than that because some of those numbers weren't disclosed with USA Today because they were either private institutions or they were like USC. We'll get to that. And Arkansas, who somehow got away with not disclosing that. So that's a weird one as well.
Pittman forgot to send a fax one day, and they were like, "Well, now we've just committed."
Look, we've discussed the Sam Pittman contract and how unique it was that he signed that with Jimmy Sexton and how incentive based it was. But I believe it still was in the 8-figure range last year. But yeah, so we won't be referencing Sam Pittman because
it's a cheap contract regardless. I don't think Sam Pittman would be on this list considering what he's done. Yeah,
exactly. He wouldn't have been on this list even after 22, just given how many outs Arkansas had with it. So here's the crazy thing. Not a single one of those 46 coaches last year who had a buyout of at least $12 million, none of those guys were fired. None of them. That is 0 8-figure buyouts that were paid last year. Neil Brown at West Virginia had the most expensive buyout that was paid for a fired head coach last year, and it was just under $9.8 million. Ryan Walters at Purdue got fired at the end of year 2, full Chad Morris experience. He got paid just under $9.6 million to go away from West Lafayette. Who among us could ever do such a thing? Worth a mention. I don't have Brian Kelly on this list. I think if anybody else is coming up with this list, they're probably including Brian Kelly. And I'm acknowledging that. Mm-hmm. He could be on this list next year. He definitely could be. The buyout at the end of this year is $51.7 million. And if you think LSU is going to fire him because he misses the playoff, all right, I guess he would crack your top 10. He's probably cracking your top 4. If you subscribe to that logic, I personally don't. Mm-hmm. I acknowledge the sense of urgency. I absolutely think it's there. I think it's really important for his legacy. We've talked about that. I think this is all about setting up for year 5. Coaches aren't getting fired after 4 years into these 10-year mega deals unless it's a Mel Tucker situation and you're getting fired with cause.
Yep.
You know, is the mega deal a bad contract with Brian Kelly? He's 29-11 overall. He's 17-7 against SEC competition with nothing worse than a 9-win season through year 3. And it's a contract that was loaded with incentives to sort of offset the fact that he was never going to be, with the way that this contract was set up, the highest paid coach in the sport. And he kind of was willing to accept those terms, a lot of which were still really, really coach friendly. And I think Kelly will make this list next year if he doesn't make the playoff this year. Fair or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered this a ton. It's not just because he's LSU's coach, but I would argue that you made similar points about one Jimbo Fisher when everybody was calling for his head and being like, hey, fire Jimbo, fire Jimbo. It's like, well, economically, we would move the GDP of Poland into someone's account if we fired him right now. We can't do that. It's going to change the tax laws in the state of Texas if we pay this buyout right now. Enron is going to be jealous of what Jimbo Fisher got out of these people. And so point being, yeah, like I know a lot of people got the, BKDS, the Brian Kelly derangement syndrome on Twitter, and they want him fired every week, and I get it. But at the same time, Brian Kelly was brought in to rebuild a program. He was brought in to win football games. He was brought in to compete for SEC championships, which he did in year 1. And so I'm very happy with Brian Kelly. And first and foremost, it's not my money. So a lot of the people trying to get Brian Kelly fired aren't actually LSU fans, let alone LSU donors. I think for the goals that Brian Kelly was brought in for, I think he's doing them very well. And when you pay that much money, you know you're paying that much money. It's not like he snuck it in there. That's what they agreed to on day 1.
Exactly. And honestly, I think if Brian Kelly, if he all of a sudden had some weird realization and opted out of this contract, could he get that contract on the open market? I bet he could. And that kind of speaks to, if that's your market value, then okay, that's what we have to consider with whether or not we're judging your contract as one of the worst in college football. One disclaimer before we get going here. There are sometimes negotiated buyouts that don't get reported on or don't get reported on for several months. So
sometimes Coach O does a podcast and he says, give me $17 million to get the bleep out. And that's how we find out. So it's a very...
We knew before that.
I know. I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Well, that's my way of saying, like, we're doing this with the knowledge that we have right now. Okay. And some of this stuff, maybe it already has changed behind the scenes and we don't necessarily know about it. So I will try and use as much context as possible. But that's how we're going to base today's arguments. Let's start at number 10, Will.
Let's do it.
Start with Dabo. Start with Dabo Swinney. Would have been higher on this list last year. And I think I would have had him in my top 3 last year if we were doing this. His buyout is still going to be a whopping $60 million if he's fired at the end of 2025. That's insane. That is stemming from a 10-year, $115 million deal that he signed at the start of the 2022 season. It is a ton of money for someone who has not won either a playoff or a New Year's Six bowl game during the first half of the 2020s decade. So why is Dabo only at number 10 and not at number 3? This boils down to something pretty simple. Maybe I'm oversimplifying this. Clemson fans are content with this version of Dabo. This version of Dabo just won the ACC. Mm-hmm. He reached the playoff. And then not only did Dabo return the number one team in America in percentage of returning production, but he made a massive swing for his defensive coordinator. So that's 2 out of the last 3 years that Dabo has made a massive swing externally to get a big-time coordinator, gets Tom Allen, and he's got 3 whole transfers. 3!
Career high. Watch out.
I mean, just trending in the right direction in that department. He has not lost his recruiting juice, which Clemson fans will be the first to tell you that after the week that he has had on the recruiting trail. And I've realized slowly over time that while I definitely disagree with how late Dabo was to the transfer portal party, I do think that Clemson doesn't care about running the sport. Maybe it looked like they should have with what they were doing in the 2010s, but Clemson seeks relevance, and doing so by their way, and Dabo doing that, even though his best days appear to be behind him as he heads into year 17, is still important. He is not getting fired anytime soon, and Clemson is banking on any sort of bottoming out scenario for Dabo as a sign to himself that he needs to hang it up. So in theory, you could have a coach that could all of a sudden be like way past his prime. He looks like a dinosaur and he's just holding you hostage. And that's why he needs to be included on this list. But in reality, would I bet on Clemson ever forking over a massive buyout to fire Dabo Swinney? No, I don't think that day will come.
I think Dabo's biggest priority is avoiding discomfort, or basically, to your point, not doing things his way, right? And if you can comfortably win 9-10 games, if you can do all that, then he's happy. But when you got Tyler from Spartanburg calling in, well, now suddenly he's uncomfortable. Now suddenly it's more stressful and it's more work to do it your way. So I think that while I want to give him credit for adapt or die and hiring the 2 coordinators, as you suggested, you have to. At the same time, you have to understand that comes at the behest of him losing football games and his life becoming more stressful and him avoiding that same stress that was initially presented as a transfer portal.
It's a good point. It's a good point. Dabo is not getting to this place and making some of these tweaks, which I don't know what goes on fully behind the scenes with their NIL. I have said many, many times, NIL has not been their problem. They were the first institution in the country to have an NIL only focused facility on their campus that is strictly devoted to those efforts. And so in a weird way, Clemson's actually been at the forefront of that. But in a lot of these other adapt or die ways that we talked about with the portal, with that being a one-way street, yes, late to the party on that, and late to the party on this, hey, we need to actually go outside the walls of Clemson to find these assistants. Otherwise, we will fade off into the abyss. So Dabo only at 10, definitely thought when I was coming up with this premise that initially he'd be higher, but the more I think about it, the more I could probably be talked into him not being on this list at all. Mm-hmm. Number 9, James Franklin. You knew it was coming. There's 2 big differences between James Franklin and Dabo Swinney. For starters, rings. Rings matter. They do. They really do. Yeah. The other thing that needs to be mentioned here is whether a fan base defends you. Do they go to bat for you? And not just on the internet, but just in general. If you have a conversation with a fan of that particular team, you can get a pretty good sense of where they're at with their head coach. And some of that obviously can be skewed in one direction or the other. But I don't see James Franklin get defended by Penn State fans in the way that Dabo gets defended by Clemson fans, you know? Yep. And that's huge. Rings a part of that as well. So is being 4-20 against AP top 10 teams.
Right.
Big part. Big part. Franklin is heading into year 12. And if we exclude 2020, no losing seasons. And that's ideal. Okay. You would take that, especially with what Penn State was before Bill O'Brien got there. We all know about the post-Sandusky stuff and how messy it was, how bad it could have been. James Franklin will be the first one to tell you he was still having to go on the recruiting trail and hear about these sanctions that were going to get levied against the program, blah, 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 blah. But he's on this list because if it does go stale anytime soon, which it definitely could by the end of the decade, and I realize I'm saying that after Penn State was one drive away from going to a national championship, that buyout will be really steep if they ever have to pay it. He was part of the 10-year mega deal, wave, boom, whatever you want to call it, in 2021. His deal runs through 2031. It currently averages $8.5 million per year with a lot of performance bonuses that are similar to Brian Kelly's deal if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. And I'm pretty sure he signed it or it was announced the same day. Like those 2 contracts were Brian Kelly at LSU and James Franklin's new deal. Jimmy Sexton.
People on the internet didn't know who to be mad at. They probably
Right?
talk to each other. They're like, we're going to drop at the same time. So the haters are totally phased. They don't know what to do.
That's another Jimmy Sexton masterclass, though.
Yep. That guy's a king. Yep.
Dude, that post Thanksgiving work, he's making sure his guys are taken care of.
As the families are sitting down at Thanksgiving dinner, we've dropped the Brian Kelly contract. And it's like your dad's like waking up from the NFL game, like, oh, he just goes back to sleep.
Guy's just sitting there trying to avoid tryptophan. He's like, oh, yeah, I guess. Oh, okay. All right. I guess
Sure.
Brian Kelly's deal, James Franklin deal coming down the pipeline. It would have been more than $56 million to fire James Franklin this past year. Again, he's not getting fired after going to the semifinals. All right. I fully understand that. Even if you waited until after 2027, you're still talking about mid-20s to fire him. And that would still be the second richest buyout ever paid to a fired head coach. But here's why it's a bad contract. Unlike Clemson, your fan base is currently frustrated. Seeing that ceiling is brutal. And while it's actually fine to only be 13th in the country in annual pay, that's what James Franklin is. He's not even top 10 in total annual pay right now, or at least he wasn't last year. Who is feeling like this contract is lucrative and beneficial besides James Franklin? You know? Who's coming up with that argument? James Franklin's underpaid. He's worth every penny. You don't see those arguments made because Pat Kraft, who Penn State had come on board as their AD, replaced Sandy Barber, that was in 2022. He had zero say in the mega deal, and now he's really without a decision moving forward for a coach that has one total win against Ohio State, and he's 3-7 against Michigan. He's 4-17 combined against Ohio State and Michigan, and 4-20 against AP top 10 teams.
And Michigan hasn't been awesome that whole time. That's the other part of it. There were some Michigan teams where they were thinking about getting rid of Harbaugh. There were some rough Michigan teams that he lost.
That's when he beat Michigan, too.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And if anyone in the pro James Franklin crowd says, hey, Bobby Bowden didn't win a national title until year 18, why can't Franklin be like that? I got a lot of thoughts on that, but I'll boil it down to just this. Bobby Bowden's first national title came on the heels of 6 consecutive AP top 4 finishes. When James Franklin does that just once, call me.
Yep. I can't believe I'm going to do this for now a second time on the podcast, but I'm going to defend James Franklin. Here's why.
How about it?
If I'm going to give Brian Kelly, I like to be fair. If I'm going to give Brian Kelly credit and say, hey, you took over a bad situation and you stabilized it, there may be no worse situation. Now, I understand Bill O'Brien came directly after Joe Paterno, but Bill O'Brien was there for 2 years and left him, Christian Hackenberg, our boy, and put him basically in a situation where it said, hey, nobody really kind of wants this job. Like Bill O'Brien got here. He wasn't fired up, but he went back to the NFL. He was not dealing with it. So having a guy crash out in 2 years the way O'Brien did is arguably kind of worse than directly following the guy, as hard as that can be. And I'm going to give you a stat here, and I just triple check this. Now, Joe Paterno joined the Big Ten in 93 and was in the Big Ten all the way until 2011, and he had 6 top 10 final finish seasons. And James Franklin has 5. So, you know, Joe Paterno won his titles as an independent in the 80s, long time ago. And they did have a year where they truly ran the Big Ten. They went undefeated in 94. They won the Rose Bowl. They finished number 2. Awesome team over there. Definitely the best team in the Big Ten that Penn State has had. That being said, in the modern Big Ten, you got to look around and go, hey, Ohio State's Ohio State, Oregon's Oregon, Michigan will still kind of see. I think that having a floor-raising coach when you are on the precipice of having your football team removed from existence by like the FBI, not even take out the NCAA, like the government was in your building trying to figure out if you were running like what you were running. So point being, I have to give Franklin credit for stabilizing the team. In year 3, he gets 11 wins, right? He makes the Rose Bowl in year 3, and he's just kind of stuck. Yeah, and he's stuck there. But like, what do you expect? Do you expect them to become Ohio State? I don't think that's really possible for there to be 2 teams like that. We saw that with Alabama in the SEC, how there was and when Georgia got there, it kind of started to Saban started fade away a little bit. And so point being, if Ohio State's kind of the all-time 1 seed in the Big Ten with the resources and everything, you assume Oregon would be number 2. I think kind of fighting for that third team playing in the Big Ten title, which Ohio State was unable to do, in a pretty big game. I think that especially with a 12-team playoff, I think that's where we start to really value guys like this, like prime Dan Mullen, where it's like, oh, you would have made a playoff and maybe won a couple of games. Maybe you have good matchups and you make a title, a la Marcus Freeman. Maybe you win a title if your guys are playing the right way. So point being, I would tell Penn State fans, like, really look around and think about the hell that you were in. Look at where you're at now after the first 12-team playoff and know, like, this is kind of where you're at, and that's just fine. I wish my team made the 12-team playoff. I'll tell you what.
Fair. Very fair. It's not going to be that long from now that they're 15 years removed from all that.
Yeah.
That'd be my counterpoint. And to use that as this is why he deserves unlimited grace, I would push back on.
Yeah, he didn't just have his best year, though. That's the thing. If we want to talk about recent, we can talk recent.
Yeah, and his best year was still a 3-loss season in which he should have, in theory, had all his ducks in a row to beat Ohio State, and we saw how that played out at home. But that's I'm an admitted James Franklin hater. Okay, I am fully acknowledging.
Don't like the guy at this point. Won 2 playoff games. Pretty impressive.
Yes. Number 8. I'm gonna get some pushback for this. Matt Rule at Nebraska. I'm gonna get a lot of pushback on this. He just led Nebraska to its first bowl game since 2016. He stole a 5-star quarterback. He is on right now an 8-year, $74 million deal with 90% of it guaranteed. It's a weird contract because he gets an average of $1 million raise every year with the way that it sets up. And maybe some of that is because there's some Carolina Panthers stuff that they wanted to be able to offset with that. Mm-hmm. But he started at $5.5 million, and the deal ends at $12.5 million annually. That's wild to have that type of a range in one contract, not just, I got a raise and I got bumped up to that, a la Dan Lanning, what he's going to end up being paid this upcoming season. So by 2027, he's going to be in the $10 million club. In 2024, there are only 7 coaches in that $10 million club. All of them, are better than 2-22 lifetime against AP top 25 teams. That's what Matt Rule is. 2-22 lifetime.
What did you just... Matt Rule is...
Nobody talks about this. Nobody talks about this because he inherited situations that Temple, not great. Baylor, obviously, disastrous.
Right.
This guy is 2-22 lifetime against AP top 25 competition. In the 21st century, and I looked this up. Shout out to our company, Sport Radar. They've made looking up stats like this a lot easier for me. In the 21st century, there are 12 FBS coaches who faced at least 20 AP top 25 teams and had 2 wins or less. Matt Rule's one of them. Okay? And I fully get the mess at Baylor. I am not discounting the post-Art Briles mess in Waco. It was bad. He did a great job. He turned that program around. Year 3, boom, he's off to the NFL after that, okay? It's why he was hired at Nebraska. He is hired for a rebuild. He is hired to get them back off the mat after Scott Frost dragged them through the mud, put them on the mat, and said, stay there until I say get up. And boy, don't you know, he wasn't going to be the one to get him up.
It was Nebraska, like toxic X vibes. It was like, next year, dude, we're going to limit the turnovers, the one-possession games. I promise. Just hang out.
If I had a nickel for every time Scott Frost said, we're going to get back to ground and pound football.
Yep.
Say that every year. And Nebraska fans are like, oh, finally. Can't wait.
Buddy, gaslit is what they were doing. Yep.
Nebraska fans got sick of Bo Pelini because he was 9-16 against AP top 25 competition. Different era of Nebraska football. Okay. And I lived it there. Yep. I did. I was there for it. Like I remember the angst, and there were definitely supporters of Pelini. How much of that was the faux Pelini stuff? A little bit, definitely a little bit. But Nebraska paid a coach that was sitting on a lottery ticket. That's what Matt Rule had with his time from the Carolina Panthers, with a $40 million buyout from them that he got. And the Huskers are covering the first $34 million of what the Panthers owed him. So there's offset language in there. That's the good news if you're the Carolina Panthers. But this isn't about who benefiting an NFL team. Mm-hmm. If it's not working out near the end of year 4, which, look, that could be Dylan Raiola's pre-draft season, Nebraska will still have $46 million left on the deal, and he would be owed $41.4 million. He basically told Nebraska when he's being recruited by them, hey, I got all this buyout money coming in from the Panthers. I can go be on a country club, in Charlotte and living a good life and make this money. And that's essentially what he's getting from Nebraska. They essentially matched that money. And then he basically built in an extension so that by year 5, he's making $10 million annually as one of the highest paid coaches in the sport. Again, he got into their first bowl game since 2016. That's not nothing. That is really significant to a fan base that cares, a smart fan base. But if you're telling yourself that this deal is absolutely going to work out perfectly, Nebraska's never going to have to think of that buyout, I would push back on that. I would be awfully worried about some of those figures with how backloaded this contract is.
This is a guy where, I remember this is like a long ongoing conversation we've had where I'm like, we're talking about Nebraska and I'm like, look, if anyone can quote unquote save Nebraska or at least set them up for success, it's a guy kind of just like this, right? And that was kind of like what we landed on is who is the mythical guy? Is it Urban Meyer? Is it whoever? And it's kind of just this guy who already has the rep. And you got the flash in the pan, the lightning in the bottle. I mean, with Raiola, who just happens to be coming up at this right time. So to your point, it is kind of a fairy tale story at this point. So is Scott Frost, right? And so point being, I get the hesitancy, but I think we will truly know what Nebraska's ceiling is when Raiola gets out of school. And if Rule can't figure it out, it's really time to panic if you're in Lincoln.
Matt Rule is going to rebuild Nebraska. But if your definition of rebuild is getting them to a Big Ten championship every year, I think you're crazy. Rebuilding is making sure that they're not the laughing stock, the team that's got the longest active bowl list streak in the Big Ten. That's what he was overpaid to do. And so for a lot of people, it's worth it. Hey, it's Nebraska. What else are you going to do with all that money if you have the support to be able to pay those contracts? Nebraska's actually got a lot of other really good athletic programs. Nebraska volleyball is a juggernaut that people don't talk about enough, at least when it comes to like the national sports landscape. But that's a different subject for a different time. That contract has potential to all of a sudden be, oh my God, are we never going to be better than 8-4? And this guy's getting paid how much? That's the thing that would alarm me the most and think, was it really worth it to pay that type of money to be able to be rebuild in, the sense that Nebraska needed post Scott Frost era?
Yeah, and I'll get off of here like after this is that you're basically paying a guy also to be polite, right? Because you come from Pliny, who was this brash guy who fit in really well in Louisiana with the Cajuns, right? And then you had Scott Frost. He was
don't skip the most polite guy in the history of college football, Mike Riley. Don't skip him.
Well, hey, he was the less successful coach, if you want to call it that. I think he was more successful, right, than Scott Frost. And so Frost comes in, it's the big flashy hire. And with Rule, it's like, I feel like he's a big warm, like gives you a good hug, says, it's okay that you struggle a little bit. We're going to get you back on your feet. And so, yeah, I think you're paying for niceness. Anyway.
Number 7, Mario Cristobal at Miami. About 11 months ago, Will, USA Today reported that in order to poach Mario Cristobal from Oregon, Miami paid him a total of $22.7 million in 2022. It's the largest single-year payment ever for an employee at a private institution.
Get your money up, Phil Knight. Need some Miami coin.
Look, Oregon's finances are weirder than people probably have acknowledged in the 21st century, and it's not this blank check. Yeah. Although, again, this is the third time I'm going to reference Dan Lanning getting paid recently, but it's worth remembering. There was a year in which, or a decade stretch in which they had 3 coaches that left for other jobs. One of them being Mario Cristobal. Part of that money, that $22 million, was Miami shelling out the $9 million poach fee to Oregon. But it was all part of this 10-year, $80 million mega deal as part of that 2021 wave. That is the contract that Mario Cristobal is currently on. He is not higher on this list because he's had multi-win improvements in each of the last 2 seasons. Clearly, a Miami grad like him is not having problems getting NIL support. Nobody is questioning that. He might have the number 1 pick in the NFL draft in a couple of months here. But the thing that I find myself asking repeatedly, are we sure that Mario Cristobal is a top 15 coach in the sport? Even if we want to just get rid of the FIU time, get rid of it. It's a strange job. It's a strange job, and it's a very hard place to have success. I haven't done the power ranking of jobs in Florida like I did when I talked about Seth Luttrell and the power rankings of jobs in the state of Texas and how I didn't think North Texas was in the top 10. But maybe FIU is not even in the top 10 in the state of Florida. Maybe we can say that. One top 15 finish from Mario Cristobal. It was pre-draft Justin Herbert, a team that also lost to Bo Nix in his college debut. He is 8-19 in his career against AP top 25 teams. I forgot. We're getting rid of the FIU tenure that he had. 8-13 against AP top 25 teams at Oregon and Miami. Not exactly programs that are in dire straits.
Right.
He's still going to have around $48-49 million left on his contract after this year. You're still probably in the low 40 millions after 2026. And even if he flirts with the playoff, which if he flirts with the playoff and not just in a way that he did this year, but actually gets into the playoff, we're not going to be talking about that buyout, but we will be talking about a raise, because that would be unprecedented for Miami. And that would be a really, really big deal. And all of a sudden, you're like, wow, the 10 million, the 10-year mega deal got boosted. That's when the Jimbo Fisher contract got really bad, when he got that post 2020 extension, which in theory made sense. If he had continued on that trajectory, would have never had to think about the buyout. But when you don't live up to it and you're a coach that isn't as proven, that's a little bit tougher for someone like Mario Cristobal. So I just come back to this. I think it's a ton of money owed to a relatively unproven coach at a place that hasn't had a coach reach the end of year 5 in the post Larry Coker era, which is coming up on 2 decades very, very soon here.
Yeah, I mean, so I have like weird perspective on this one. So on one hand, Miami money is whatever, right? Like Life Wallet stuff happened. That place, if you're talking about weird money, he went from the second weirdest money to the first weirdest money in college. So it's not like they're going to spend it on more wholesome or wonderful things, I guess. But at the same time, I just still, maybe I'm crazy, man. Maybe I'm crazy, but I just think Manny Diaz is still a better coach than him.
It's not the worst take I've heard. It's not the worst take I've heard. Manny Diaz had a really nice first year at Duke too. And at a place that, look, I gave Mike Elko a lot of credit for the job he did in 2 years there. But I do think that basically telling Manny Diaz, Mario Cristobal is coming in and taking your job, not even having this formal firing, but more so, if he's available, we're going to get him. And we're not firing you in a traditional sense, but we just see that we could probably get our guy and we need to spend crazy money to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So you're fine, but we're going to go with Mario. That's basically what they did to Manny Diaz, who's a perfectly fine coach.
Yeah, like that's kind of my thing, is that in my opinion, you don't really have to pay the money. I know the board of directors was all over the place, but was this season really that much better than the De'Aaron King season? Like I know this team was in the top 5 for a lot of the year. I know they felt like it, but what did they do? They missed a 12-team playoff, just like that team would have. And that team finished like 22nd. I'm looking at it right now. So it's like, yeah, I think that like at the end of the day, they spent all this money. I mean, if you think about like Cam Ward coming in, I mean, that's a upper 5% of how well that could have gone, and yet still you're getting the Eric King results for Cam Ward and Mario Cristobal money. So that's kind of my take.
The only thing that I push back on is his value provided at the game's most important position, getting to New York, finally getting someone from Miami to New York, probably helps you out, and also the NFL draft conversation. I don't think you're getting Carson Beck or a player that is reportedly as coveted as he was in the portal. I don't think you're getting someone of that caliber, if not for
his girlfriend.
The year
that's the real recruiter. There's a P next to her name on 24/7 Sports.
All right,
anyway,
fair point. Yeah, look, it is just one of those contracts though that, man, if he has that multi-win regression this year, and it's an 8-4 season, all of a sudden people are going to be going, he's still owed how much? Hey, that's going to be tough.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, let's go in a different direction here for number 6. Justin Wilcox at Cal.
Wow, this guy hates fun. Look at this.
Yeah, I do.
After I'm back from California, look at this.
Yeah, just Berkeley's an interesting place. Very interesting place. Context is important. I mentioned how 8-figure buyouts are now the standard. Mm-hmm. This past season, Justin Wilcox's buyout would have been nearly $16 million. Plenty of Cal fans wanted to see that paid to a year 8 coach who failed to deliver Cal its first winning season of the 2020s. Speaking of that, after a 5-7 season in 2021, Justin Wilcox got a 5-year extension worth $28 million guaranteed. Yeah, crazy. He has since gone 16-22 with an 8-18 mark in conference play. And remember, that straddles both the Pac-12 and ACC. Who could forget ACC powerhouse Cal? He is also in that stretch 0-12 against AP top 25 teams. I guess if you want to count almost beating aforementioned Miami in a game that if you turned off early, you probably still think that Cal won that game. Mm-hmm. They didn't. Cam Ward did Cam Ward things. Didn't happen for them when College Game Day was in the house. But Cal basically said, you know what? We're going to kick the can on your contract after 2021. And he would have been owed, at that time, $16 million with his buyout. The irony is that 3 years later, they were in the exact same spot, and they still couldn't pay that buyout. After 2025, he's still got 2 more years left on his contract, which runs through 2027. So after 2025, he's still going to be owed about $10.5 million. But knowing Cal, it's probably just going to say, hey, you know what? We went 5-7. Let's pay him $5 million per year instead of paying twice that with a buyout and then having to hire another coach on top of that we're probably going to have to pay around $5 million anyways. It is horrible losing logic. And it needs to be included here. And that's why Justin Wilcox needs to make the cut. Also worth remembering, Cal had this massive athletics debt. Sportico reported in 2023 that Cal had an outstanding athletics debt of $439 million, which was more than twice as much as any SEC school with the exception of A&M.
Because they built like a earthquake-proof stadium. I remember this. Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And they have 30 sports.
Yeah.
They pride themselves on having all these different programs that cost them money and cost them, they go into debt as a result of having all these different, people make fun of the SEC and say like, oh, they don't want to have 24, letter sports and they'd rather have, 18 or 20 or something. Well, having 30, not good business, right, turns out. And it's the problem that is fueling a lot of these decisions. And that's probably why Cal is in such a unique spot compared to other institutions, even though it did just get into the ACC. It got a life draft from the ACC. But if Cal could do it over again, the obvious path in post 2021, hire Dion and reap the financial rewards of that move instead of paying that extension to Justin Wilcox and then just hoping you're going to close your eyes and wake up in a different place 3 years from now.
Yeah, I'm going to it's honesty hour right now because Cal has literally been relevant in 2019 for a minute. They won the Red Box Bowl. Who could forget, right? And then,
I watched that game. I remember Michigan State played that game. It was really, really ugly. I mean, like the type of game that you're just scratching your head going, I've got to have something better to do. I think it was on a Thursday afternoon or Friday afternoon, I want to say. And I thought to myself, I should have something that's occupying my time because this is not entertaining football.
Yeah, so that's, I guess, more or less your high point other than the Calgoritham stuff this year. And I haven't really had a reason to care about Cal, so I'm just going to be honest with you. There was a stretch here after 2019 where in 2020 they played 4 games and went 1-3. Then they went 5-7. Then they went 4-8. I just assumed that this gentleman got fired. I'm just going to be honest with you. I thought they had a new dude in here, and that's why they were like irrelevant and good, and they changed the culture. But we previewed a couple of these games. So I'm like, this is Justin. You're so right. And I don't understand. First off, I don't understand how this team finished 6-7 because, like, I thought the whole thing about Cal was like, wow, they're way more talented than we thought, and yet they still finished with a losing record. I'm at a complete loss as to why this gentleman has a job. For just 2017, he's been at Cal. That's one of the longest tenured coaches in college football right now. What are we doing? You already built the earthquake stadium. Just build somebody who puts butts or get somebody who puts butts in seats. Like do what Arizona State did and get like a Dillingham or something that can just live in a apartment on campus that just wants to be a head coach. If you can't pay him, like it can't be worse than advanced mediocrity like this. They were fun for a minute. That's why I said you hate fun, but I looked at like kind of what happened to them last year, and yeah, that sounds like a horrible experience as a fan. You got game day, you finished 6-7, brother.
Justin Wilcox, if he hit the open market, would probably be one of the more coveted defensive coordinators. I think he'd be one of the best defensive minds in the sport. He did awesome things at Wisconsin too before he left for that first head coaching job. But this contract is absurd. It's absurd the logic that's been used to extend him at different points. And I know that Cal fans, as much fun as they're having on the internet, they're not having fun when they're thinking about their future and how tied they are to Justin Wilcox for very frustrating reasons. Mm-hmm. All right, number 5. Didn't think he'd ever be mentioned on this list, but he has to be. Mark Stoops.
Yep.
Andy Staples used to call it the best contract in America, and I would nod along, and I would say, yep, that's it. It is now one of the 5 worst contracts in college football, and it might even be higher than that. UK had its 3rd consecutive disappointing season, and everyone knew that paying a $45 million buyout for the best coach in program history to go away wasn't going to happen. In 2022, he signed an extension with UK as a top 25 team. The very next day, Vandy comes into Lexington and pulls off a stunner in the snow. It did not age well.
Yep.
It has not aged well. The only good that came of that contract, which now has him in the $9 million club, is that it deleted the clause in there that added a year to it if he won 7 games. No longer does that exist in the way that it used to, much when Andy Staples would reference how advantageous this contract is really for all parties.
Mm-hmm.
That deal forever said, we just want you to be 7-5. And if you could do that, we'll never show anything but love and support for you. That time has since passed. If you exclude 2020, UK had 7 consecutive seasons of doing just that, getting to that 7-win mark. But now you're coming off of a 4-8 season. He's still owed $35 million at the end of 2025, which, oh, by the way, Will, Zach Calzada, is he going to be the guy that's going to overcome your regular season over-under of 4.5 wins? Bad contract right now.
I love Kentucky fans. I grew up, I've told you guys about this, listeners that have been here for a while. Some of my best friends are Kentucky fans. I have a group chat with them and Drew Page and all that. I love Kentucky, but I can't say Zach Calzada, especially now without laughing. I'm sorry. If that's your plan, I don't know what you're going to. Maybe he comes out and he's awesome, but maybe not.
Incarnate Word has done some special things,
They have.
You never know.
Yeah.
But I'm not holding my breath.
Nope. Yeah, I'm right there with you. It feels like the game is kind of passed him by, but he also feels like he doesn't really have anything to do. We talked about him having kind of like the bourbon distilleries and stuff, but it feels like he is a guy who kind of should have rode into the sunset after maybe this last season, perhaps. And it's like both parties are just kind of like, and again, I always hate to talk about the basketball team at Kentucky, but given, you had the Cal thing happen, maybe keeping a guy around. And a lot of this, I'm going to take 1,000-foot view on this too. A lot of these guys we're looking at is, again, it's stability and not admitting you made a wrong decision when so much conference realignment is happening. Not exactly sure that's happening here, but you've just had a shakeup, right, with your coaches. So it's like, well, let's prove that we can retain the greatest coach we've had, to your point, and not kind of show him the door. Was it Robert Dunder that Michael Scott did that to? Yeah. It's like, you don't want to do that to Mark Stoops if you've just lost another legend in the middle of all this stuff. So I get it. But at the same time, I'm just not super optimistic about Kentucky in 2025. And it sucks that we have to do like a kind of a late Bobby Bowden year here,
And they don't have a Jimbo Fisher waiting in the wings.
That's the other part of it. And it could have been, well, maybe not. Maybe not.
Maybe John Summerall is their Jimbo Fisher.
Yeah.
The problem is that John Summerall is not on Kentucky staff right now.
That's the other part of it. It's like he has a whole life and family and stuff. Maybe his kids like their classes. Did you ever think about that?
Yeah. As EJ Manuel shared on this show, when he was being recruited from Florida State, even at that time, they were being told, Jimbo's the coach in waiting.
Right.
Like, if we do a coaching change while you are here, the next coach is already on the staff. You're not going to have to worry about a new offense being implemented or something like that. And that was the good thing about that situation, which is very, very unique. I probably shouldn't compare anything to the Bobby Bowden situation. One of one in a lot of ways. But yeah, that right now for the longest tenured SEC head coach is a troubling reality that is facing Kentucky moving forward.
Yep.
Number 4, Luke Fickell. Luke Fickell at Wisconsin, man. If you can believe it, he's already received 2 extensions at Wisconsin. Now, you might not have heard of both of them, but here's how this works.
Okay.
Even for a guy that's 12-13 so far, coming off of Wisconsin's first losing season in 23 years, both of those extensions that Luke Fickell got at Wisconsin were just adding a year to the end of the deal. And Wisconsin has their athletic director board decide annually if performance was satisfactory. They do that for all their coaches. And so
you don't want to get called up in front of the oat board, dude. The Wisconsin Board of Regents. Hey, I think you could pick it up a little bit. Anyway,
I don't know how that works. I would love to be a fly on the wall for those situations. If that's an individual interview with the committee and they present their case and they say, we did this, we did this, we did this. Maybe Luke Fickell just kind of threw up his hands and went, well, Tyler Van Dyke got hurt against Alabama, so I don't really know how you can judge me on the rest of the season when this played out, expanded conference. I don't know. But those negotiations are not so much negotiations, and it's just the people in a room saying, do we want to add another year to your contract, a la what we just talked about with Mark Stoops, or do we want to just say, nah, we're going to leave it where it's at? It would make headlines if they decided it wasn't positive. And maybe that then gets out, and suddenly everybody that's recruiting against Wisconsin can point to them not having alignment. Hey, they didn't give him that extension. They're clearly not satisfied with that. This is the backwards logic that works in athletic departments that is so maddening for people on the outside that have normal jobs that look at this stuff and go, wait a minute, you went 5-7 and then they added a year to his deal because they didn't want to be dragged through the mud on the recruiting trail? What?
Yep.
But it still made headlines because of the fact that this is a guy that just missed the postseason at a place that hadn't missed the postseason in 23 years. And that's a problem, okay? And it's a dumb clause that I can guarantee you with how spoiled Wisconsin has been with its coaches. And we can talk about seeing that ceiling, but the reality is when you've had all those different coaches come in the 21st century, I'll even include Gary Anderson, who was like, I'm going to leave for Oregon State. We'll even include him in this conversation. When you've had all of those coaches show you that you can meet this floor, you don't have to think about the things like that critically, okay? And they buried that announcement in a release announcing extensions with their other coaches. They had like their volleyball coach in there. I think like their swimming coach was in there. Add another year to their deal. You know what this is though, Will? This reminds me of the guy who played 3 sports in high school, who goes off to college, and instead of the freshman 15, it's the freshman 30 because he didn't realize that he couldn't get away with eating like crap. And basically he's like, oh shoot, I'm not playing sports anymore. I'm going to gain all this weight. Wisconsin is kind of in that situation where it has not had to think critically about how it releases news like this. They're not familiar with having this, oh my gosh, we got to pay this buyout, that buyout. Wisconsin, even when it should have had to pay that ridiculous buyout with Paul Chryst, they got him to accept an $11 million buyout instead of the $20 million buyout that he was owed, because I think they reworked some of the back end stuff and they're like, hey, we'll just pay you this amount of money up front and not have this spread out over the course of several months, whatever. Luke Fickell's contract runs through the 2031 season. His buyout last year was $40 million. He gets 80% of the remaining deal. The problem is if you keep adding a year to it, that number is really not going to drop a whole lot. And it's not really going to drop into the $12 million, that standard range, until after 2028. That's 4 more years. Woof. Big old woof.
You know, man, Wisconsin is a brand that has such an identity. And you know what's so interesting to me is you talk about going in front of the OAP board, the board of directors, getting the extra year, all that. That's not even surprising to me, right? I remember covering, let me double check this. Yeah, it was the Outback Bowl where Barry Alvarez stepped back in and coached Melvin Gordon after, like, your point about Riley
2014,
leaving.
Wisconsin, Auburn. Yep.
Yes. Your point about Riley leaving to Oregon State. So the thing about Wisconsin being
Gary Anderson leaving for Oregon State.
You're right. So sorry, I got them confused. Gary Anderson, right? And so point being, one thing about Wisconsin is they've been incredibly consistent over their history. This is a team that hasn't won a national title. I think that Wisconsin is very happy to have a good day at the ballpark, if that makes sense. They have the jump around. They have a consistent football identity that has happened over their entire tenure. And I will say this, it is less surprising to me that Luke Fickell got those extensions because of the winning than that he got away from the brand and didn't get fired, because it was fine to be ground and pound. That's why Alvarez came back twice, mind you, because it was like, hey, we need the adult back in the room. We need the old, by the way, Badger, such a perfect nickname for them. We need the old Badger back in here. We're going to run the ball. We're going to get some guys with Whiskey on the back of their names. They're going to start pushing people around. It's going to be great. Okay, you go and you change that, you don't succeed. It just goes to show that, like, maybe these are just very level-headed people, and they're just like, you know what? We're going to give this guy a chance, because I'll tell you what, man, every time I talk about Marcus Freeman, I need to talk about Luke Fickell, because I need to give Marcus Freeman more credit for what he's done at Notre Dame, because the pathway was so clearly there for Luke Fickell to be the next great college football coach, even to the point of, he was the interim at Ohio State. He played there. He kind of was the cast-off son. He went to Cincinnati, made the playoff, was the first Power 5.
The only group of 5 coach to make the 4-team playoff is an incredible thing to have on your resume. And 2 years ago would have been considered one of the best hires possible. And instead, 2 years later, we're looking up and going, this contract is terrible. It's horrible.
This is the most shocking outcome for a coach to me. It's so much more shocking to me for Scott Frost. And speaking of, they took over in 2017 when UCF was entrenched in the American Conference. Fickell took over at Cincinnati, right? And then boom, 1 year with 4-8, and then 11-2, 11-3, and they just basically are amid a dynasty. And mind you, UCF hires Josh Heupel, so it's not like they lose their guy and they're screwed and they got nobody left. It's that Fickle comes in the middle of an American Conference dynasty after being cast off. He then makes a Cincinnati dynasty with the dude Sauce Gardner and those boys that they had over the course of these next 4 or 5 years. And you go to Wisconsin, it's like, oh my God, they got so lucky that they even got a chance to hire this guy. He's going to come in and change everything. He's going to bring in the area. It's going to be amazing. And I'm looking here going, this is aggressively mid. Like how I thought this would go versus like I've only seen their offense look good one time. And it was against Matt House right before 2 of his defensive tackles almost fought him on the field because they hated him so much. And so point being, I've not seen this team I thought they would be a 2-win team or like a 10-win team. Like I was 90% sure they'd be a 10-win team. Let me start there. But if they were bad, it was going to be bad. But it's weird that they're extending not because of the Wisconsin way and that they're always very patient, but that they ripped all that up and it's not working. And he's like not even trying to do the ground and pound thing. I don't know.
It's a very strange situation. Very, very strange. And if you just want to chalk it up to, well, we don't judge year one coaches on the show. Fair. His quarterback got hurt in September, year 2. Okay, fair. I don't know that Tyler Van Dyke was leading them to 9-3. I wouldn't sit here and say that. But, they had that lead against Oregon. Remember? That was fun. That was their best moment of the season, maybe. I mean, oh my gosh, everybody tune into NBC right now. Oregon's on the ropes. Undefeated Oregon. Oh no, Wisconsin's going to find a way to mess this up because they really do not have the horses to be able to go 60 minutes like this and beat a team like Oregon.
And real quick, not to stay on Wisconsin, but I'm glad that we're checking in here. Dude, remember he came in and coached their bowl game. It was like the most wild, seamless transition where it was like...
This is every once in a while. Every once in a while it happens. It's
but
weird.
In terms of first-year head coaches, he got in that building early, kind of the year before, and already put that pipeline in, so he should be ahead of schedule. Anyway.
Yeah. Did not think Luke Fickell would ever end up on a list like this, but here we are. It goes to show you how unpredictable this sport is. Mm-hmm. Number 3, Brent Venables. Earmuff at OU fans. Speaking of contract extensions that left some scratching their heads at places that have had a lot of 21st century success, let's revisit the extension last year that was announced a week before Oklahoma officially joined the SEC. It was the inverse of the Dan Mullen extension. Mm-hmm. Instead of making a massive bump in base pay, OU makes a massive bump in what? The buyout figures. His buyout will be $35 million if he's fired at the end of 2025. I actually was a little low on it when we talked about it last year. Thought it was $31 million. Nope, $35 million. Of
course.
Mind you, that is for a coach who owns OU's only 2 losing seasons in the 21st century. Blame that on Lincoln Riley if you want. Blame some of it on Lincoln Riley if you want, if that makes you feel better about this situation moving forward.
But here you are.
Yeah, you're still in this spot, and people are still questioning whether or not you're ever going to rise to even tier 2 of the SEC moving forward. And the reality is, if you go to a place like that in this era of the sport, you suffer losing seasons 3 times in your first 4 years, which if he suffers a losing season this year, that's what's going to be on the table. You should be able to fire that coach. That's pretty standard, right? It should not cost you $35 million to pay that guy to go away. And that's why this is a bad contract. He's going to be tied for 9th in the SEC in annual salary, and his buyout is still brutal. And it's brutal as a result of that extension. I talked about it last year when that deal was announced, that what OU was banking on was getting a value for a guy who can make the playoff and can continue to recruit top 6, top 7 classes. And they're going to look up and go, hey, look at all these other SEC head coaches that are making more money than you. Look at what we're doing with a guy that's being paid less than that. That's what they thought was going to happen after a 10-win season. Then they went 6-7. The offense was historically awful. And you're scratching your head going, this is not going as we hoped. And suddenly in year 4, you're generating all the wrong headlines.
Yeah, it reminds me of, we've talked a ton about Venables, so I won't say too much here. We talked about, the breakup with Lincoln Riley, and it's almost like, getting a tattoo with your new girlfriend as soon as you break up with the other one, saying, "Hey, I never loved you. I'm locking this down." Da, da, da. It's like,
It is,
no
isn't
one
it?
really asked you to do that, dude. This is a coordinator who had ties here. Yeah, it was hard to get him out here, but no one's doing this but you. So start looking around and wonder, is everybody else crazy or did you make a mistake? And so even if it works out, which I think we're both a little bit more bullish, certainly than last year in Oklahoma, it really honestly can't be too much worse in Oklahoma, given that everybody got hurt, right? I mean, the guys never really showed up. So we're more bullish on him, I think, than some people. But point being, you just never really, I think, had to sign this contract or extend it or do all the press and say, we're so happy. It's so amazing. We're all better off. Like, we still need to evaluate a guy who really has not been a head coach before. And sometimes that's rough.
I would have been okay with the bump up in base pay
Mm-hmm.
and keeping the years the same. I would have liked that more if it would have kept the buyout not at what it is.
Exactly.
And that's probably my biggest problem with what Joe Castiglione did, is that all of a sudden you looked up and you went, oh man, this is all of a sudden a whole lot of money for a guy that, yeah, it just gave you that nice, solid year two, but this is still Oklahoma. And if you're not going to live up to that standard, yeah, the standard may be lower in the SEC, and there is an expectation that, hey, you're not going to go 11-1 and just be an annual pick to make the conference championship like you were in the Big 12. We get that, but there's still a whole lot of ground left to make up, and Venables needs to do that in 2025.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, Mike Norvell.
There he is.
You knew it was coming. Had to be coming. FSU was not going to pay nearly $64 million to fire Mike Norvell in 2024. A year removed from the 13-0 starts and the, let's just call it very 0-1 finish that they suffered in 23, that wasn't going to happen. He wasn't going to get the boot for one nightmare season. We talked about how when we did the hot seat index, how Norvell last year probably would have been at like a 2. And that's probably what saved him his job. History shows you can have that one bad season, but what does it look like moving forward, and how quickly do you overcome that?
Do you hire Gus Malzahn to be your offensive coordinator?
Man, I wasn't going to bring that up because I feel like I say a lot of negative Gus stuff, but you're not wrong.
No, that was the moment I gave up on Mike Norvell. I actually really respect Mike Norvell, and I got a bunch of friends who are Miami fans, and I'm sitting here going, hey, Mike Norvell's won more ACC championships than Miami has, so let's quiet down about that, okay? But when you hire Gus Malzahn, who I just watched at UCF, for your offensive coordinator role, I go, oh, this is only I don't say it's gonna get worse, but it won't get much better.
I talked to a few FSU fans after that, and they echoed that sentiment.
Yep.
Yeah, not overly optimistic. The 8-year, $84 million extension definitely wasn't just to keep him away from Bama. It was merit-based, and not because the idea of the coach leaving your program for Alabama and the big bad SEC, that wasn't going to happen. Like, no, not at all. He's a year removed from that deal. So in one sense, you can talk yourself into FSU getting back to who they were in 22 and 23. We're going to have EJ Manuel on at some point moving forward this offseason. And he's going to, I'm sure EJ will lay out that path. He's also probably going to talk critically of what did not work this past year. But what if it's only a 6-6 year in 2025? FSU is still going to be on the hook for 85% of his remaining contract. By my very bad math, that would still be nearly $54 million that he's owed if FSU wants to fire him at the end of 2025. A guy that's showing up on a lot of hot seat lists. And I don't know how many people are really referencing that buyout, but it's context that matters for this. If FSU wants to wait and pay, I don't know, $36 million instead of 54, that would also still be the second richest buyout ever for a head coach that's been paid. It could wait until the end of the 2027 season. That's 3 more years. And that's for someone who had 3 losing seasons in his first 5 years on the job. It is a bad contract when you see a 2-10 floor. And I'm not saying that FSU was crazy ridiculous to give him that sort of extension. If they were under the impression that that's what it's going to take to keep this guy from leaving for Bama, I get it. You finally have momentum that you've been lacking post Jimbo Fisher, even late days Jimbo Fisher, obviously. But man, this has all sorts of potential to just blow up in FSU's face.
Yeah, this is honestly even weirder than Luke Fickell because he had the success in Memphis, then he had the success at FSU. So it's like we've seen FSU be a formidable team that went 2-0 against my LSU Tigers. We've seen them, hang in games against Florida. We've seen them be competitive on big stages. They beat Clemson, when Clemson was kind of on their downswing. And we've seen them finish, in the AP, they finished 11th and 6th, so not quite 2 top 10s, but close enough, right? And so, point being, you put 2 seasons back together, but with one quarterback, Jordan Travis, right? And so I'm going to say it like this. FSU has so much extraneous stuff going on right now that the amount of PR I've heard out of them where it's like they are like trying to keep pace with Florida and to a degree Miami, but really to get out of the ACC, right? And we talked about the grant of rights deal last time. I think that publicly, when you have a season the way that they had that puts you back on the map, you don't want to move on from that guy because you don't want to quote unquote admit you're wrong, and you're not sure you're wrong yet. That's the thing. It's only been one bad year technically, right? And so point being, I think they have to hang on to him to save face, number one, to say because they're selling this message of we are this super attractive destination. Any conference would love to have us if we could just escape the ACC's grant of rights deal. We got all this stuff figured out. Come pick us over Duke, UNC, whatever. Well, firing your coach makes that a lot more of an unknown. Also, the financial implications, we've seen the rumors about them reaching out to, different investment firms and different sources for money. And so weirdly, I think that Mike Norvell is as insane as it sounds, third or fourth on FSU's problems right now. Because let's say that Norvell figures it out, but they still are in this murky, weird situation. Then I don't know they're much happier. But one thing about Norvell that my boys would always tell me that at this point is now becoming a problem. He's not a great recruiter. He famously lost Travis Hunter to Deion Sanders, which now we can see that obviously worked out for Travis Hunter. But at the time, it was bad.
His biggest hits are portal guys.
Yep. All of them are portal guys almost. Almost all of them. And sometimes you hit on those guys and sometimes you don't, but you end up with a mercenary army, which on one hand, you could turn a team around like this year, which is really good. On the other, you got some Sonny Dykes in there with TCU where it's oh, wow, we're just trash now. And I don't even know why,
It is a program that probably was very desperate to avoid what happened with Jimbo Fisher and leaving for Texas A&M.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if that happens multiple times in a 7-year stretch we'd be talking about, all of a sudden people kind of scratch their head and go, what's going on there? You guys must be doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think FSU, truth serum, would admit, late on the facilities upgrades, they still got dudes that are pulling the Cincinnati Bengals walk to the practice facility.
Yep.
And it's kind of strange to see that at a program that's considered to be one of the best, historically speaking, in college football, and went on one of the best 13, 14-year runs we've ever seen in the history of the sport.
Mm-hmm.
But that is still going to be hanging over FSU. Is what is their reality? What is their standard now moving forward? Because it has been truly all over the map with Mike Norvell, and they need a bounce back year in a big, big way, or else everybody's going to be dogging this contract.
Yep, absolutely.
Number one. OU fans, I told you to earmuff it before. You okay? Take the earmuffs off.
Take them off.
Take them off. Lincoln Riley's number one on this list.
Yay!
This is the runaway winner.
Mm.
The runaway winner. You've got someone who was the 4th highest paid coach in the sport this past season, who went from 11 wins in year 1, 8 wins in year 2, 7 wins in year 3. His initial deal, 10 years, $110 million. I said initial deal for a reason here. The buyout figures aren't public knowledge in the USA Today database. If you've got that pulled up, you will see a blank space where Lincoln Riley is. But Pete Thamel reported at the end of last year, I think he reported this in November, that the buyout to fire him at the end of 2024 would have been around $90 million. $90 million. The crazy thing is, he would have only had, if you average it out, $77 million left on his deal. If he had been being paid $11 million per season, do some quick math, take away $33 million from 110. That's how you get to 77.
Mm-hmm.
So if Thamel's number is right, USC either did a more backloaded deal or they did some restructuring post year 1, maybe post year 2 at some point. I can't go full Iowa notepad on this buyout because the terms aren't public.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the new Jimbo Fisher contract. It is. The difference is that Jimbo actually recorded a top 4 finish in year 3, unlike Riley, who went 6-6 in the regular season. Again, another coach on this list who beat your Bayou Bengals, but we don't need to go there.
Hey, Texas A&M as well. Let's loop us all together, all right?
Very, very true. Guys who can't pull off winning records in the Big Ten probably shouldn't have $17 million homes with, 12 bathrooms. Probably doesn't really fit the description of middle-of-the-pack Big Ten coach. This contract is aging like an avocado. It just is. Or rather, this contract is aging like Lincoln Riley's warped brisket. There was an interesting development, though.
Well, there was maybe a point where this was a good thing. Lincoln Riley's brisket, I don't think ever got off the ground.
True. Very true. Maybe when he initially put it in the smoker.
When he put it in the smoker.
Are we sure he used a smoker on that thing? Did he just stick it in the oven and put it at 500 degrees or something like that? Maybe.
He used a blowtorch. Anyway.
Got to get the marks on it. It's really important. There was an interesting development, though. And file this away, because I have never brought this up on this show. And I need to bring it up more often as we talk about Lincoln Riley's job security moving forward. USC got hit with probation last season for having too many analysts engaging in coaching activities in 2022 and 2023. Now, if you recall, they opened it up in 24, and that is no longer against the rules.
Mm-hmm. And now they got Rob Ryan.
Right? Matt Hayes wrote about this, and I was reading this column earlier today. USC could have fired Lincoln Riley with cause last year and paid none of that buyout. It didn't do that. It didn't do that at the end of year 3 because you want to make sure that your big time 9-figure investment isn't 3 and out. That's not when you want to be 3 and out. It's not. I would assume that the further and further removed you get from that, from when all of this came out that they were going to be on probation, that probably if you get to, let's say, 2027, and your USC administration, you say, we want to fire Lincoln Riley with cause after 2027. Lincoln Riley would absolutely take you to court and say, if this was truly why I was fired, why didn't it happen in 24? That doesn't mean Lincoln Riley would win. That doesn't mean they would even settle. But it is an added layer to where even if that card is ever played, it's going to be a bad look for all parties involved, which further adds to why this is the worst contract in college football.
We hate the NCAA, so we will kind of go backward and explain. Will Wade is a great example, right? Will Wade, basically, if NIL was legal, would have been fine. But the way he broke the NIL rules was so bad that I don't even feel that bad about it. Pete Rose is another one. Oh, he's gambling on baseball. Good. No. He was there's some stuff he was doing. If you want to read up on it, I'm not going to talk about Pete Rose here.
Go to Pete Rose and spend a day in Cooperstown during induction week and realize that man is on the sidewalk begging people for his autograph. Not begging people, but begging for people to come up to him and tell him about how great he was and how he should be in the Hall of Fame. Pete Rose was a joke. I don't feel bad saying that. I witnessed him be a joke, and people that defend Pete Rose do not have full context of who that guy was. And I get it. He's bitter. This turned into something I didn't
see. I was I don't know why I'm getting, but no, point being, you've told me about that. And point being, we hate the NCAA so much. Come on, some analysts, why could that be a problem? It's no. You are payrolling people. There's a number of people you could have. You are either uprooting someone's life or doing whatever you got to do to get this person in the building and give them team merch and give them a parking spot and do all that. When the number is X and you decide to do Y each and every day, that just makes that it's stupid NCAA rules. No, but you chose to break that every day. You chose every single day to not count the amount of assistants you had ducks and be wait. And so point being, they could have gotten out from that, but point being, I don't think that even if he countersued, let's say they fire him with cause and then it gets opened up and he countersued.
Doesn't have to countersue. It just has to sue in general. It would be low.
Oh, you're right. Sorry. No, you're right. He would just basically make a counterclaim, which would then be a lawsuit. You're right. But if he said, well, look, that's legal now, not the way you did it, brother. You broke the rules every day. And so that's actually a really good little twist to this. But yeah, I just have no idea what he reminds me of Cliff Kingsbury so much. He reminds me of I've talked about this kind of class of guy where it's like Sean Payton, maybe a Dan Mullen, or the highest level of these guys where they end up as head coaches, but they really should be the best offensive coordinators in America. But that's not how this works. You got to pay guys a certain amount of money. And so he just ends up being head coach, even though he doesn't really want any of that responsibility. So clearly he does not want to manage and be a leader of men. He's the opposite of Dabo Swinney. And so point being, I just think that where USC is positioned, who Lincoln Riley is as a human being, I don't think it's going anywhere positive. And to know that they could have gotten out from under that when they'd already, gone through a lot of the tumultuous stuff, they already gone through. Yeah, they had some pretty solid years, but I think at USC you got to have a little bit of shame and think, all right, well, we clearly are not trending in the right direction. Even coming into this year, it was pretty clear that hey, man, we both thought LSU were going to beat them. Anyway, so point being, I think that I don't know how they get better from here, because what Lincoln Riley lacks is a person off the field, and I hate to just generalize a guy, but it's toughness, right? You see the way he handled the transition into the USC job, the way he handled, the comments after they lost to Oklahoma State and all that different stuff. He just is not a guy who conveys do your job, toughness, all that. And that's what his team's lack, and that's what the Big Ten's about now, man.
There are certain places where you don't have to worry about the buzz wearing off.
Mm-hmm.
Your floor for fan interest, fan support is still going to be ridiculously high, even if you blow chunks.
Mm-hmm.
USC is not one of those places.
Yeah.
USC is a place that can look up at an empty stadium and go, we've got $70 million that we still owe that head coach that is responsible for the current optics that you are seeing. That is a terrible spot to be in. That is a nightmare spot to be in for an athletic director. And if you don't turn that around in a hurry, buddy, they're digging up dirt. They're digging up dirt, and they're finding some way to say, we got to find a way to get out of this. You cannot afford to not capitalize on this window and to capitalize on this transition to the Big Ten. Whether or not Lincoln Riley would have signed up for this job if he knew that the transition to the Big Ten was going to be part of it, that's debatable. Okay, we could say that he escaped the SEC. We could say that, but the reality is, it's only on him. And if he were to get fired with cause for something like that, it would come back to him, and he would have nobody to blame but himself.
Yeah.
And that is reality now for a coach that has been just given a blank check, a check that is going to continue to be scrutinized, I think, in the latter half of the decade, unless he all of a sudden shows real adaptability in ways that he has not so far during his entire time as a head coach, not just at USC.
Yeah, and I hate to, sound like Colin Cowherd here in the mid 2000s, but I think you're totally right. Not that you just did, but like, hey, look, you look across town, and for kind of the back part of your season, you got LeBron James in one of his last seasons. You got Shohei Ohtani on the front end of your season. The whole time you have the LA Rams who just won a Super Bowl. So having the imagery of USC in like kind of an empty stadium. Lincoln Riley used to be this kind of like young, passionate guy that is kind of just wilting in front of our eyes. Is just so. I mean, he deserves it, so it's not like I feel bad for him, but it is a sad visual. And I think of a USC, and you found, you found some success in other programs and stuff. I think that you have to kind of say, what actually are we here? Yeah, maybe we're not expecting Pete Carroll because like those teams drew. The Reggie Bush teams, the Matt Leinart team, people were watching that in LA, despite having some Kobe and Shaq overload or like overlap, some of the Dodgers stuff overlapping. They had some great teams, but this team is just not fun to watch. It's just a goofy, soft, boring team.
Different era, better coach.
Yeah.
Two things, really, really simple.
Yeah.
All right, so here's how this list breaks down. I had at 10, we started with Dabo Swinney. Dabo at 10, James Franklin at 9, Matt Rule at 8, Mario Cristobal at 7, Justin Wilcox at 6, Mark Stoops at 5, Luke Fickell at 4, Brent Venables 3, Mike Norvell 2, and Lincoln Riley at 1. Your 10 worst contracts in college football. All right, let's kick it to Ryan McGee. We discussed a bunch of Tennessee stuff, plus some great stories from his nearly 3 decades at ESPN, why Marty McGee works so unbelievably well, and a lot more with him. So here's Ryan. Now excited to be joined by a very special guest, a first-time guest. It is Ryan McGee. We had your dad on many, many years ago to promote the book that you guys wrote together, you and your brother. What's the book that you didn't get to write that you kick yourself thinking about, and why is it the story of 2009 Tennessee?
Yeah. No, it's in 2009 Tennessee, and then I'm old, right? So I was a student working for the football team when Johnny Majors was pushed out in 1992, and that's the one I've always wanted to write. And when Coach Majors passed away a couple of years ago, I touched on it just a little bit in the story. Everyone knows, no excuse, I'm not a Phil Fulmer guy, and the reason is because, I literally know where the bodies are buried on that deal. And so it was, so a Tennessee drama book would be, my wife is like, and when I met my wife at Tennessee, she was a performer at Dollywood. Like, she's a playwright. I keep telling her one day, and she's a musician. I keep saying, I want us to write an opera about Tennessee football because it would be amazing.
The Pruitt part of that would be fantastic. Dude. I don't know who you're going to get to play Pruitt and Butch Jones. That would be tough casting because they feel so unique.
Well, if the anger guy from Inside Out was real life, he would play Butch Jones, right? And I'm not sure you could find maybe. I feel like if you gave Chris Pratt a bad haircut, he could maybe pull off. So I had a chance to speak at graduation at Tennessee just 2 years ago, and what I talked about was that generation to me, and my daughter's part of that generation. She doesn't go to Tennessee, but that generation doesn't get enough credit because that's the school shooting, COVID, so social media, we've thrown way too much at that generation for them to be as normal as they are. And I kind of went through that list I just went through, and I said, we made you guys, go through the Jeremy Pruitt era of Tennessee, and the chancellor thought that was really funny. I was a little nervous about being pulled off the stage, but she was they literally had just had those hearings where we all sat in the lobby and watched them all walking in and out of the hotel conference rooms of the NCAA. So it was all still a little raw at that point. But yeah, I need to think about casting that film. That'd be amazing.
I would be here for it. I would attend that musical. Haven't attended many musicals in my life. The list is probably about 3 or 4, but I would see that, especially if they got it down here at Dr. Phillips in Orlando.
You wouldn't survive in my house because my wife is a singer and an actress, and my daughter has followed in his footsteps. And so now I've spent way too much time in my life. But you talk about dad though. My mom and dad loved. They took us to the theater a lot when we were kids, and so I'm not going to tell you I love it, but I'm going to tell you that I've attended more than 3. I've attended more than 3 this year.
Look, the sports musical crossover, High School Musical tapped into it, obviously, but in terms of like a Broadway style production, it might be, Damn Yankees, that's one.
My wife played Lola in Damn Yankees when we first got married, and here in Charlotte where we live. But then I wrote a story for ESPN magazine years ago about Heisman the musical, and it was not good. but it happened. I mean, that thing played in several cities, but it was all about the 222-0 game, and Georgia Tech greasing the rails on the railroad. All this stuff was in it, but it was terrible. But it was so it is still out. It's out. I need to call College Football Hall of Fame and tell them to track down some old video or something.
I mean, SEC Media Days in Atlanta. Just we'll make it happen. That'd be the perfect spot for it. I got a lot that I want to get to with you, but let's start with Tennessee. Vols are coming off of their best 3-year stretch in 2 decades. It's easy to forget that after the way the Ohio State game played out, but you're a Tennessee grad, so you understand this perspective in very unique ways. But I think there's this angst that could be felt over the course of the next 3-4 years if certain heights are not reached. You've seen the feels like 98 vibes. You've also seen the why is Butch Jones using that trash can vibes. The trash can, by the way, would have to have a role in the musical of Tennessee.
Oh, yeah. No, it'd have its own song. You put somebody in like Oscar, the Grouch, right? All of a sudden, picks up his orange, pops out and sings. See, there you go. It writes itself.
It really does. How should this fan base feel right now about the direction of the program?
All right. So when you say this fan base, what you're talking about is me and my group chat with my old college roommates, the Horsemen. There's 5 of us, my in-laws, my wife, I mean, everyone. And what I'm constantly preaching to everyone is don't not enjoy what's happening because you're obsessed with what you should be doing next. And what I have to remind everyone is, what did this feel like 5 years ago? What did this feel like 10 years ago? What did this feel like 20 years ago? And so enjoy it. And you made a great point though. So I was at that Ohio State game. That game was over in 5 minutes. And it's easy to be hung up on that. But what I always go back to is, you've mentioned 98. People forget. But the year prior to that, Peyton Manning and company got their butts handed to them by Nebraska in what was a national championship game. I go to the College World Series. When Tennessee finally won the College World Series, and I was there, last June, it took going to Omaha and having their heart broken a couple of times and, being the number 1 seed and losing, not even making it to Omaha one year, for them to figure out how to not just get there, but how do you handle it when you get there? And so I tell the Tennessee fan base all the time, enjoy what you have. You made the college football playoff. That box is checked, right? You're back to playing, in New Year's Day bowl games. That box has been checked. You're in the national conversation. That box has been checked. Those boxes weren't checked for a long time. So there's only a couple steps left, which is, being a national championship game and win a national championship. But just enjoy it a little bit. That's what that angst you talk about. And it is well earned, because that is that is PTSD that it was relived over and over and over and over again. Which is why you could write more than one book about it. But yeah, enjoy what you have now and hope that you're ready to take the next step. And I think they could. I think that we have the handful of teams that are going to be competing for national championship, and then you have the handful of teams that could crash the party, which is kind of what Tennessee was a year ago. It's who they're going to be again. We all forget Nico's still a kid, and so I think they have the potential to really do it up. The trick is, again, enjoy what you had in 2024 before you ruin this spring and summer already expecting to be disappointed in 2025.
I've been wondering this for a little bit, just based on his temperament, based on how he has approached this job, and now the comps, the side-by-side comps that are becoming more fair. I know you're not a Fulmer guy, but can Heupel be what Fulmer was in that job? Just being a guy that can navigate it for a decade plus and provide that stability? Or is that just unrealistic in today's landscape? And there's just always going to be an expiration date with a coach, unless, of course, you win a championship.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be an expiration date if you don't win a championship. I mean, that's the case everywhere, and it's unreasonable. But that's what makes college football the greatest sport in the world, is unreasonable expectations. It's what keeps guys like you and me with plenty of stuff to talk about, right? But again, I think this goes to the myth of Phil Fulmer, and this goes to the myth of what Tennessee fans, how they feel about the past, because the reality was that until they won that championship in '98, they hadn't won one since the early '50s, and they had great success, but the reality was they were always in the back seat of the Alabama car. They just were, or Georgia, not Georgia, but Alabama, watching other teams win national championships. And so, the Philip Fulmer thing is like the myth of what that era was. The reality was it was a series of disappointments. They won a national championship in '98, but then after that, you go back and really break it down, it was a lot of disappointing 9-win seasons, and especially the last 5 or 6 years. Half those years were awful, and people forget now they all wanted him fired. And so, even a guy who has a road named after him and who has a national championship ring and who, came back as athletic director, and that went great, right? But even that guy, people forget this now conveniently, they ran him out of town on a rail. And so yes, at one day, that it will end poorly for the current coaching staff at Tennessee, because it ends poorly for everyone. No one ever retires, on their own terms unless you're Nick Saban. That's just not how that goes. So yeah, that's inevitable. But it is part of the Tennessee personality, and it's why I love the school, and why I love that fan base, and why they also drive me crazy, which is that expectation level that is so high. But the reality is that even when you thought things were the best they ever were, they were great for 1 year. And the rest of the time they were in the conversation, which is what everyone wanted, but they really didn't. Every time they had an opportunity to win another ring, they usually figured out a way not to do it.
You were in the great Heisman race of 1997, that 30 for 30. You did a lot of work on that. Can you share the memory that you have post Heisman decision of experiencing what it was like to go back to Tennessee when Tennessee fans hated ESPN and College Game Day was public enemy number one, and you got to experience that firsthand as someone that obviously is this Tennessee grad and working for ESPN at the time and navigating that space?
I had graduated just a couple years earlier. And then at that time, I was covering motorsports pretty much full time, and I was a producer. I wasn't a writer yet. I wasn't a reporter yet. I was a field producer. And so I was sent to Peyton Manning's last home game against Vanderbilt in '97 with Steve Cyphers, the great Steve Cyphers from OG Game Day. Was a reporter. I was a producer. And we interviewed Peyton on Friday during practice. They're in the stands at Neyland Stadium. And the Vol Walk was really new. The Vol Walk didn't show up until the mid-'90s. And so, of course, the day of the Vanderbilt game, it was a crappy day. It was raining, and it wasn't cold, but it wasn't hot. It was kind of miserable. But the team starts the walkover from the football facility past the torchbearer down the hill. We all know it now, but at the time it was relatively new. I had on an ESPN raincoat, and people were throwing rocks at me. And, I swear I think I saw some people that I knew throwing rocks at me, right? And I'm holding up my Tennessee class ring, like, stop it! I just graduated here. I'm rooting for the guy just like everybody else is. And then again, I don't mean this to be a Philip Fulmer podcast, but the game plan was awful that day. You're trying to win a Heisman Trophy, and they didn't throw the ball at all. Manning had and it was a sloppy day, but whatever. If he can grip it, he can throw it. And it's Vanderbilt. They should have hung 400-yard passing yards on those guys and 5 touchdowns, and Manning might have won the Heisman Trophy still. But he had one bootleg run for a touchdown, and the rest of the game, I remember standing on the sideline, and an athletic administrator who I will not name from Tennessee, who I'd known from my time there as a student, I'm standing on the sideline, and he leaned over and he goes, "You remember that time that Peyton Manning lost the Heisman because they decided they wanted to run the football?" And it's kind of how it was. But that was also the day he directed the band. I've got a great picture I took with like a little Kodak, throwaway camera. And then, but I kind of knew that day leaving, I was like, he's not going to win it. There still was that part where you thought, and I wasn't a voter, and there was still that part where you thought he has a chance. But yeah, it's funny how the world turns, man, because now, like I went to Ohio State for the first round CFP game, got off the plane, and the first thing that happened was some guy, in a Eddie George jersey screamed, "What the F are you doing here, SEC guy?" And I'm like, yeah, well, let's take it back to my alma mater when they were yelling at me because they thought, we were taking the Heisman away from their guy. So it's just, we all hate everyone's team, Connor. You know that. When they give you your credentials to games, there's a thing we sign, right? This is, you hate everyone's favorite team.
I pretty much approach this job with that in mind, that I hate your favorite team.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I have a personal vendetta against
We have
each
meetings. Yeah.
We do. We discuss who's most hated.
Yeah. The internet's right. We all have secret meetings. We all have when we have FCC media days, we all the writers, just so y'all know, we all have a secret meeting where we all say, all right, we're all in agreement, right? We sign the agreement that we hate everyone's favorite team.
I did something last offseason where I disclosed all my biases, and I said, this is legitimately how I feel about these specific people, and if it feels like I'm not giving James Franklin the benefit of the doubt, here's why. And here's why, in my experiences, this is why I feel this certain way.
Yeah.
It's something that, look, maybe we need to get into, because there are certain biases that exist, but this belief that everybody is constantly working against your team, it is exhausting, and it's more convenience than ever. And I'm sure you've experienced that in very unique ways over the course of the last 3 decades.
Yeah. And I tell you where I learned the ability to check it at the door. Cause you and I both, we get to talk to college classes, when we're on the road for Marty McGee in the fall, a lot of Fridays, I get a chance to go talk to journalism class, whatever. And within the first 3 questions is always, well, how do you not root for Tennessee, or how do you not, and you just don't. And I learned this from my dad. My dad, I grew up in the Carolinas. My dad went to East Carolina. I went to Tennessee. My brother went to Wake Forest. My dad got a master's degree at App State. There's a lot of connections there. But when he walked into a football stadium in the ACC, which is where he spent most of his career as an official, he didn't care who won or lost the game. And everyone has a hard time wrapping their brain around that. Back when I was a kid, we were sitting they used to do this at Chapel Hill all the time. You're sitting in the stands, and they would announce today's officiating crew, at Kenan Stadium. So-and-so and so-and-so, and so-and-so is the referee, and I'd say, and field judge Jerry McGee, graduate of East Carolina University.
What?
And everybody's boo, but the perception was that because of that, and because of where my dad had gone to school 25 years earlier, that he cared who won the North Carolina Duke game. He didn't. And I learned that from him, checking in at the door. When Bill Hancock, when they first started the CFP meetings, he'd have everybody hang their hats up the door or whatever they came in. That's how you go into the press box. Now, all those years as a Tennessee alum, when I would sit there at Bryant-Denny and watch Alabama just beat Tennessee's brains in, at the time, whatever, I'm covering a game. Now, when I got in the rental car, was I a little pissed? Probably. But you take those hats on and off, and as you get older too, you're not as emotionally involved in it as you used to be. The job's the job. Unless it's your favorite team, y'all, then I hate them.
You've worn a lot of hats for ESPN. Either you or Wright Thompson has this title. Who's been in the most 30 for 30s? Because you've got to be really close.
Yeah, Greg Sankey's joke is that I was actually born in the 1800s, because between SEC Storied and 30 for 30 and CFP 150, I sit there and tell these stories, and Sankey's like, you make it sound like you were at the 1958 Iron Bowl or whatever, and it's like, we know you weren't there. But my wife, well, you know the deal, man. I got all these books, right? I mean, if you can see it, I basically my office is a library. All this stuff that I've read and my whole life, and the people at the College Football Hall of Fame will tell you, I'll just show up and just want to look at stuff. And my wife, I remember when the CFB 150 stuff aired a few years ago, my wife was like, bless your heart, you finally got to talk about, how Bobby Dodd ran practice, right? All this stuff that, So yeah, but I don't know. Wright at one point got a little shy about being on TV because he thought it affected his ability to like fly on the wall, write stuff. And I feel like I benefited from that, because we need a Southern guy to talk about, fried chicken in Memphis. Call McGee.
Christian Laettner. Hey, that's
yeah. And then sometimes, as I tell my daughter this all the time, who's in college now, wisdom has nothing to do with being smart. It's just that you've been around a long time. And so they start looking for, like, talk about Christian. I was in college when Christian Laettner was in college. I remember all that stuff. And so, I was not in attendance for, the first College World Series in Omaha in 1950.
I always love talking to ESPN lifers like you and Fowler and Reese. It's because there are so many people like myself who grew up watching, ESPN and SportsCenter in the 90s. And just the ESPN programming was just such a massive part of our childhood. And at least for me, meeting people like Stuart Scott or Dan Patrick would have been right on par with me going to Old Orchard Mall as a kid and meeting Grant Hill. Like that, that's where that would have, stacked up. And I got to imagine that walking those halls when you did in the 90s, having that be like, oh my gosh, I'm just out of college. I'm getting this experience. What was your favorite pinch me moment from that era being at ESPN?
So, I wrote a book a couple years ago about this one summer I worked in minor league baseball. And the first chapter of the book is about me going to ESPN and bombing my interview. I mean, bombed it, because they purposely asked questions about hockey and about like the AFC West and stuff they didn't think a kid from North Carolina would know, the answers to. And they were right. But the day I flew myself to Bristol, stayed at what was a Radisson right across the street. I had my coat and tie on, and I'm sitting in the lobby of Building 3, which is the heart of campus, still is. And I'll never forget it. I was sitting there nervous. I don't get nervous. I was terrified. I mean, flop sweat, terrified, waiting to go up and do my interview for a production assistant position. And Charlie Steiner came walking through the lobby, just matter-of-factly talking with Tom Meese. And that did not help my nerves, dude. Like, it was all of a sudden. But I remember the two of them standing over in the corner and just having this conversation about boxing, and which was Charlie Steiner's bag, and I was just me eavesdropping on those guys. And to the point that when they came down and said, Ryan McGee, like at the dentist office, you need to come, I didn't hear him, because I was eavesdropping on that. And then the deal was you had a year between interview and hire. If you didn't hear from ESPN within a year, then you had rotated off the list. They called me after 362 days. I still hold the record for that's how bad my interview was. But my first day on the job, same thing, coat and tie, I go do the drug test, and I meet with HR, and I fill out all my paperwork and all that stuff. And they go, well, hey, this is good timing. We have our annual family picnic at Lake Compounce, which is the amusement park across the street where famously Milli Vanilli got busted. And okay, so I go walking across the street, and as I'm walking in, Charlie Steiner comes walking out. He's leaving. And he's got to go do the 6 o'clock Sports Center. And Charlie goes, I go, hey, Charlie, this is my first day. I'm really excited to work here. And he looked at me like, okay. And he goes, well, this isn't a funeral. And he just did this, because I'm wearing like a black jacket and a black tie. But yeah, that was literally the first 2 times I ever set foot on campus. But it was bizarre, man. It was Reese was brand new. I came in with Kenny Mayne, Reese Davis, Susie Colber, Bill Pito, kind of the original young, cool, Stu Scott, the original kind of young, cool ESPN2 crowd. And that's when the dudes started. And it was, what's weird though is now, man, it's been 30 years. You go back in the building and there's certain hallways and stairwells smell just like they did in 1994. Like, it's like being back on college campus. You're like, oh, okay, now I'm back where I am. And then it's not also 19 degrees and you're like, screw this, I'm going home.
You've also had the benefit of not having to live in Bristol your entire time.
Yeah, I was there 2 years. I was in Bristol about just a little less than 2 years, and we set all the snowfall records that they've just broken, like in the last couple of years. And I just remember thinking, but I had a great time. I mean, it's boot camp is what it is. You go to work at 4:00 in the afternoon, you come home at 4:00 in the morning. You're a vampire. You sleep till noon, 1:00, go back to work. And but I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. And just like boot camp, the friends that I made along the way, who are now scattered all over the business, we've got a bond that you can't replace. But it's the only place I ever wanted to work. And I left for a few years and spent the whole time trying to get back. And so the next time I go, it'll be because they told me to leave.
Yeah, you were able to spend that time at Fox, and then ultimately, you come back and you find this unbelievable like niche where you get to do a variety of things, which is kind of the dream. And it's one of the reasons that, professionally speaking, I really look up to your role and what you get to do on a daily basis. And you've been able to establish something that is so hard. I don't know if viewers know how hard it is to keep an on-air partnership. And what you and Marty have been able to do is extremely unique. It really is. And Marty McGee is now a decade old. I've never asked Marty how you guys met, but I imagine it was just some NASCAR pit situation where you guys just started chopping it up and you're like, want to go grab a beer? Something like that. There's got to be some sort of story of you guys connecting and instantly realizing that you guys were going to hit it off.
Well, what's funny is, so when I went to ESPN as a production assistant, again in the mid 90s, I wanted to work on college football and baseball. That was kind of the house I grew up in. And literally the month I started, Jeff Gordon earned what was, to me, still the biggest win of his career. And he was young and cool and my age, and suddenly NASCAR was cool in the building. And what I realized was that the line of people waiting to work on college football and baseball was all the way around the building. The line of people waiting to work on NASCAR was 0 people. And I had this Southern accent. And so they were like, well, you know all about NASCAR, right? And I did. I mean, my dad, again, dad's the man. He was on pit crews, when I was a kid. I'm from Rockingham, North Carolina. So I didn't know as much as they thought I knew, but I knew more than they did. And so started working the NASCAR thing, got me moved back to North Carolina after a couple of winters. I met Marty. We don't remember the exact day. It was sometime around 1999, 2000, and he was writing for like the Lynchburg Gazette, and eventually moved over to Turner to write for NASCAR.com. And I was a field producer. I was a feature producer. So I was on the road 25 races a year with Bill Weber, who everybody knows from Talladega Nights, and Dr. Jerry Punch, who was my hero, John Kernan, all these reporters. And I was their producer, like I was for Steve Cyphers that day in Knoxville. And Marty and I met. We're pretty sure it was somewhere in Virginia, either the South Boston Speedway, the Martinsville Speedway, Langley, one of those racetracks in Virginia. But my claim to fame, and y'all can blame me for this, is when I left ESPN, it was to produce a show for Fox Sports Net called Totally NASCAR. It was a national show, and we needed a Peter Gammons. We needed an insider. We needed a Pete Thamel for NASCAR for the Garage, and Marty was writing for NASCAR.com, and so I'm the first producer to green light putting Marty Smith on TV. And he came in as our insider analyst. I remember the first day he was ever on TV for us, him in the green room, with his wife Lainey, and he was nervous and should have been. And I remember telling him, dude, you know more about this than anybody else. Just talk when I say go, shut up when we say shut up, and you're good. And he was really good. I mean, obviously. And then come 2006, 2007, he and I both are back at ESPN. And we were driving to the Martinsville Speedway and for like 2 or 3 hours up there, 2 or 3 hours back. And it was the funniest conversation I ever had. And I was like, man, I think people would dig this. And we called the podcast department, like, just let us record something. And yeah, it's been more than a decade, man. It's crazy. But with my producer hat on, and you know this, there's been a lot of shows that I worked on and that were on TV where you took really, really talented people, like Emmy award-winning anchors, and put them on a desk together, and it just doesn't work because the chemistry's just not there. Or they don't like each other, or they're not actually friends. Marty and I were friends first, and so that's it. And so when we do the show now, it's still with the spirit of that drive up to Martinsville that day. And I hope that's what people like about it, is the fact that we're not. It's easy. I mean, it's super easy. I'd love to tell you that we have this struggle, and I think he and I've had 2 arguments in 12 years. You know what I mean? So it's just and they weren't even that big. So it's knock on wood, they still pay us in American money to do it, and we can't believe it.
It was Virginia part of the South, and we know where Marty stands on that, and that was, that probably just led to an argument. And then
that's what it was. Yeah, I was like, was it really? Because it seemed to be. I always refer to it as a border state, not Maryland, Virginia, but it's not even a damn state. It's a commonwealth. Like, make up your mind. But yeah, he doesn't like that. But dude, I learned this when I started traveling into the SEC that I just didn't know growing up. When I started going into Louisiana and Mississippi and all, they don't think North Carolina is Southern at all.
Oh,
and I'm like, well, how the hell do you think I sound like this? Because, but yeah, they don't. South Carolina, they say yes. North Carolina, they say no. I have no idea why, but that's just how. When I went to school at Tennessee, John Ward, the legendary voice of the Volunteers, when I was working in the athletic department, Ward one day he goes, Ryan McGee said, so where are you from? I go, I'm from North Carolina. He goes, oh, I love North Carolina. I used to go there all the time until my passport expired. And that's how people, like in the deep South, feel about North Carolina. So apologies.
I can relate to that a little bit, just in that I live in Florida, but I don't live in the South because I live in Orlando. Like, it's not.
No. Orlando's where the South stops, everybody says, right? Just north, you're still there. But yeah, once you get into Orlando, but whatever. I grew up in Raleigh. Well, growing up in Raleigh, in the 80s, everyone I knew was from Connecticut. And then when I moved to Connecticut, none of them had ever met a Southerner. So I get that.
I think people appreciate with you and Marty how authentic you sound. And I've talked to Marty about this before, about how, one of the things that he tried to keep at ESPN was his accent, and it was authentic to who he was. The fact that he was covering NASCAR made it a lot easier, but you guys hit it off and sound so Southern. And when you sound the way that people listening to you also talk, and when you look so natural, when you guys are doing your SEC Network commercials and it's, driving in a truck, and that's basically what the scene that you just painted with those first conversations. And I can definitely see that type of thing happening. And, you don't necessarily have this like back and forth where it feels like one is stepping on the other's toes. And that's something that's really admirable. And I like how you root for him, even when it's, singing with Celine Dion and harmonizing with her and getting to do stuff like that.
Dude, so people ask all the time, the difference between Marty and McGee. And I always tell them, I said, the first thing is that Marty, like, I have to buy shoes. I bought my truck. Marty just gets sent stuff, like pallets of stuff just show up at Marty's house because he's famous.
He's elevated your sneaker game too.
Yeah. No, he has. But I bought mine. His were sent to him by like Michael Jordan, But like, so for example, like I was in Boston earlier this week and working on a story I'm really excited about. And I had talked to a really famous singer on the telephone, trying to convince him to do an interview with us. And I just thought it was amazing that I'd had this 5-minute conversation, with this amazing singer on the telephone. And I can't tell you yet, but you'll know once the store runs in April.
Neil Diamond,
yes.
If I had to guess.
And, yeah, it is. And so I'm all excited, right? I'm like, and then I go to dinner with my wife on Fat Tuesday, and I'm literally bragging to her. I think we might, get Neil Diamond, or at very least get like a story. I'm going to get talk to him for a story. And Erica goes, well, Marty's singing with Celine Dion right now on television. So people, you want to know what the difference is between Marty McGee? The difference between Marty McGee is that I get excited to interview a singer on the telephone. Marty sings with maybe the greatest singer of the last 40 years, on national television. So it's awesome. But Marty, and Marty loves, he studies country music. Like, and he's great friends with Eric Church and Kenny Chesney and all these guys. But he loves to study it. He reads every book that any country music artist writes. But he came to me with the story of Brooks and Dunn. And Brooks and Dunn really don't get along. Never have. And they have tried to break up like 5 or 6 times over it. And he and I the example he's always said to me, we can't ever be those guys, because like Brooks might have a problem with Dunn and Dunn might have a problem with Brooks, but they wouldn't say anything to each other for 6 years. And it just would become a thing. I just read Alex Van Halen's book, and there's clearly stuff that he and David Lee Roth have still never worked out from the 80s. And as a result, they can't keep it together. And so what Marty and I have talked about all the time is if there's an issue, tell me. If you think I'm talking too much, tell me. If you think I said something behind your back, tell me, and let's talk about it. And that's, like I say, I think twice we've had 2 arguments ever. And the one time that like it got tense, we figured it out. And that was a long time ago. And so, yeah, knock on wood, man. We try to cancel out jealousy because Lord knows if jealousy was a problem for me, then when, I turn on, Marty Smith's America, which was his TV show he had for a couple of years, and he's on the roof of some building in Singapore interviewing Cristiano Ronaldo, I'd probably be jealous. But I'm not. I'm excited for him because I can't believe a kid from Harrisburg is doing what he's doing, and I think he can't believe that a kid from North Carolina is doing what I'm doing.
So what do you want to do that you haven't done next 5 to 10 years? It's a question I feel like I'm asking in every interview now, but especially with media people, I think it's interesting because you've seemingly got ESPN saying, hey, Ryan, do you want to do this thing? Go out and do it. Like you have that freedom. What's something that is still on your professional bucket list that you'd love to be able to kind of check off over the course of the next decade?
It's funny. My wife and I literally just had this conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I have no complaints. I'm doing more than I ever thought I would do. I'm healthy. My daughter's doing great. My wife's doing great. I mean, I wouldn't trade. I love what I'm doing at work, and I'm getting to do it. And I love you mentioned the variety of it. I miss ESPN the magazine for a lot of reasons, but the biggest thing was that, I never knew what I was going to be doing next. I might be doing a snowmobile story followed by Usain Bolt, followed by college football, followed by NFL draft or whatever. And I'm kind of back to that right now, within the company. And so I don't know where the calls are going to come from. And I like that some people don't like that. I won't say instability, but the you can't predict what's next, and that part of it I love. And then the baseline is Marty McGee. But I think we're at this crossroads right now in college football, where, and I keep going back to my NASCAR experience, where there was one of the great philosophers said, success, can mask really bad ideas. And college football right now feels a lot like NASCAR did 20 years ago, where everybody's doing so well and making so much money that you can make bad decisions right now chasing money that don't look like bad decisions. But 5 years from now, we're going to go, what the hell were they thinking when they did that? Because you alienated the fan base a little bit, the old school fan base. And so I say all that to say, I think the next thing I would like to do is something that reminds us of why we love the sport. It's taking all these things we have now that are new and sometimes scary, but also very exciting. Then how does that tie back? The fact that, I wrote a story this past year, was the 100th anniversary of the Four Horsemen game in 1924. And that was the Army Notre Dame game in 24. Well, the Army Notre Dame game this year was super important. And I think that's what college football needs to have more of right now, which is, that first round of the college football playoff was so crazy new, but the games were at Happy Valley and Austin and South Bend and in the Horseshoe. And it's taking advantage of that. And it's also taking advantage of the fact that we have so many of the greats still with us. And 5 years from now, we won't. And 10 years from now, we definitely won't. So we need to take advantage of having them on the planet with us and some sort of project that can tie those things together. Because I think people are going to start like they did with baseball in the 80s when the salaries really started blowing up. People are going to start leaning into nostalgia more than they ever have. And in college football, they do that anyway. But I think there's a wave coming where you could really benefit from that storytelling-wise. And so something along those lines. I know that's very non-committal and amoeba-like, but you get what I'm saying, I think.
The correct answer was actually being a documentarian for the Bill Belichick era at UNC and just writing weekly essays on that.
Dude, that's going to be – it's good. That is – I am so all in on that because, again, I grew up in the Triangle. My dad was an ACC official for 40 years for the most part. How they're going to take who might be the greatest coach in the history of the National Football League and still turn that into an 8-win season in the Mayo Bowl is going to be fascinating because that's how it's going to go.
I'm just saying, ESPN could be calling, hey, Ryan, we need you on just Chapel Hill every single week. Just lock it up. Brian Windhorst to LeBron is Ryan McGee to UNC.
That's
with
it.
Belichick.
Well, you talk about a fan base that is always been convinced that I hate them because I've been very open about the fact I grew up a big North Carolina State fan. And my brother went to Wake Forest and my dad went to East Carolina. Well, you must hate us then. The reality is I did when I was 12 years old. But I don't care anymore. And Mac Brown's one of my favorite people I've ever known. But watching them turn that into solid 8-win seasons and third place finishes in the ACC is going to be because that's who they are. That's just what it is.
Yeah. This has been awesome. I want to get you out of here on some rapid fire, just 5 questions. First thing that comes to mind. Does that work for you?
Yeah, sure.
All right. You are the authority on minor league baseball. The best minor league baseball stadium in America is what?
McCormick Field in Asheville, and that's an emotional answer. I wrote a whole book about the summer that I worked there, but the reality was the ballpark's been there 101 years, was carved into the side of a mountain, and was christened by a home run by Ty Cobb. And that's also, by the way, where Crash Davis hit his last home run in Bull Durham. So I'm not sure what else you want.
Yeah, that's okay. That is a good answer. You had to sell me on that. That was a very good sell. Which notable person gave you the most outrage ever for a bottom 10 mention?
I just recently received a text from a former Pac-12 championship coach who wanted to know why during this particular era would ESPN want to run people down with the bottom 10. And I gave him the same talk that I give everyone, which is it's not mean-spirited. We never mention players by name. And the reality is that I've been doing it for more than 10 years now. And when a team who won the bottom 10 championship suddenly becomes good, UT San Antonio, Georgia Southern, or Georgia State, any of those, I usually get a care package. So I'm kind of in it with them, right? When they turn the corner. But yeah, no, that was probably, I got one super, super angry phone call from a former SEC coach who landed in the Sun Belt. And I don't think that call was actually aimed toward me. I think it was just aimed toward life. But I'll let y'all do the math on that.
Was it aimed? Was a trash can mentioned at any point of that conversation? Probably not.
I do not recall, Senator.
Okay. Who's the next first-time national championship coach in college football out of these guys? Or you can pick somebody else. Dan Lanning, Steve Sarkisian, Brian Kelly, Marcus Freeman, Kalen DeBoer.
Dan Lanning, I think, is the easy answer. By the way, just got a new contract. But and I wrote this on ESPN.com. We did a roundtable a couple weeks ago about preseason stuff. It's still Oregon, right? I mean, they are recruiting at an SEC level. I love Dan Lanning. He is one of my favorite He was one of my favorite personalities in the game when no one had heard of him. But it's still Oregon. They still are ranked number one and still couldn't win the Rose Bowl and still like it's still all of it was there. But the reality was they still over the last 2 years have lost the 1 or 2 games they needed to win in order to win a national championship. So with all due respect to my boy Mike Bellotti and anybody else who ever coached there, it's the same as it ever was. But I think he's the answer because and he loves it there. Like anytime everybody talks about somebody moving or whatever else, I'm like, Dan Lanning's good. So I think that's probably the answer.
What's your favorite meal you've had in an SEC town?
All right, so I'll get divorced if I don't say Ye Old Steakhouse in Knoxville. which is folks don't know, that's where the great Bud Ford, sports information director at Tennessee forever, would take writers, and where I would save my money for months to take a date. And my wife and I actually went there on one of our very first dates, my future wife at the time. But we kind of have a hookup at Ole Miss when we go in to do, and again, this is the benefit of having famous friends. So we go in to do Marty McGee / SEC Nation. And I would love to tell you that we are ushered into these back rooms from these 5-star world-class chefs because of me. The reality is because I'm with Tim Tebow and Laura Rutledge, and Wright Thompson usually comes shows up because he's from Ole Miss. But yeah, I've had a couple of meals like in restaurants that were closed that they just put us in with a private chef that were just crazy. But listen, tailgating at LSU, the best food I've ever had in my life is cooked by some guy whose name you can't pronounce and who has like a glass eye and looks like an extra from Pirates of the Caribbean, and is literally just cooking it in a pot that was borrowed at an Army Navy store and has alligator in it. The food in a parking lot in Baton Rouge is better than anything I've had in a Michelin star restaurant in New York.
I would agree with that. I would absolutely agree with that based on my one experience doing just that. Last one for you. What's a hillbilly headline to describe your career in this business?
Son of an Eastern North Carolina lit head accidentally gets his own TV show. I think it might be it.
That's it. That really is. It tells you everything you need to know about not just your career, but your entire life.
Well, and talk about Wright Thompson. We were doing the show at Ole Miss a few years ago, and we had Wright on the set with us, and he really wanted to do hillbilly headlines, which is hilarious, by the way, because he's won every award there is to win. But Wright, I read one, Marty reads one, we get to Wright, and Wright, instead of reading the one that he had, his headline was 2 rednecks from Western Virginia and Eastern North Carolina get their own TV show, and no one believes it. And it was like, and the crowd just went crazy because it's the truth. And that's, now I will, if that's the epitaph, that's the epitaph, buddy.
Wright Thompson just improvising headlines on live.
Yeah, whatever. Like it's it makes you mad. Yeah, it's you kill yourself on a story for months, and then you're talking to Wright, and he says 2 sentences, and you're like, damn it, I could have just written that.
Makes it look easy. He absolutely does. Ryan, really, really appreciate the time. Looking forward to seeing you in Atlanta for SEC Media Days in a few months.
Anytime, buddy.
All right, well, let's close with some Lad of the Week. Want me to start, or you want to go?
I'm good.
Let's go with Texas women's basketball coach Vic Schaefer. Viral clip. I'm sure a lot of people saw it. If you haven't seen the clip from Jeremy Rosenthal, who, by the way, I used to see back when I was in college in Indiana, worked in the athletic department, IU grads, doing things. Love it. This clip is worth your time. Really is. He shouts out the 3 student newspaper reporters who drove 16 hours each way to cover the SEC women's basketball tournaments. Love that. Absolutely love that. And he says, please write me as a reference on your resume. Vic Schaefer, awesome move. Spoke about how proud he was that they did that. They were willing to do that. This is spring break time for college kids too. Like that's not nothing. It's not just, I want to take a few days off of school and be. No, there's a real commitment that goes into something like that. Long live journalism, long live student journalism. Feinbaum shared how Dale Brown, the legendary LSU basketball coach, offered to be a reference when Paul was just a young student journalist trying to get a job, and how it really helped him out. And it was a big, huge experience in his life. And not to get into the whole journalism matters discussion, which I'm sure many people listening to this hate the media, and I'm not here to tell you that you should not hate the media or anything that we're about, but I'll share this just from my perspective as a student journalist who was in kind of a similar position back when I was a senior in college. So 2012, covered Indiana men's basketball, and basically was at, I think, every game except the Minnesota game. And that was just because we didn't want to drive all the way up to Minnesota to go to this game, which was very far from Bloomington.
Chris Humphrey's disrespect. Wow. No, he was going to I'm just kidding.
Look, Twin Cities, bet it's an awesome summer city. I've heard great things. Haven't been there, actually. I've never been there in the summer. One of my best friends goes there all the time and absolutely loves it. But yeah, just did not make that one trip. But every other game we were at. And it was a big deal to be able to experience what it's like to cover a team, and you're actually writing stories that are on the front page of the student newspaper that are distributed across the campus. That's got, however many thousand students that have access to it. And we went through Selection Sunday that year, where Indiana has this rise from the ashes type season in 2011, 2012. Oladipo, Cody Zeller, the Christian Watford shot against Kentucky was that season. And so Indiana was going to be in the NCAA tournament, and they got a 4 seed that year. And so we knew on Selection Sunday that we were very likely, all right, we're about to have to go book flights and cover a team that could be playing anywhere, and found out that they were playing in Portland, and then immediately find out from our management at the time, hey, we can't afford to send you guys there. We can't afford to make this happen. We're like, what? So we're just not going to cover this team that we've covered all year when it's their biggest basketball games that they've played in, however, 6 years, 7 years, whatever it was. And
did you do a car wash?
We didn't. We did the modern day car wash.
Okay.
Like GoFundMe.
Heck yeah.
And the support was unbelievable. It was like one of the coolest things I've ever seen was seeing how many people heard about this, that the student newspaper reporters weren't going to be able to go because the newspaper didn't want to fund the trip, and seeing the outpouring of support that we got from campus, from the community, of people that donated to people that they've never met, have probably just seen our byline or something like that, and allowed us to go. And we were going to pay our own way to go. And then we had someone in our corner step up, and someone that's got a big social media following within the university step up and say, I'm going to do what I can to get this off the ground and get some support for you guys. And they were able to make it happen. And it was awesome. And it was an unforgettable experience that I wrote about on cover letters. I talk about getting there and not knowing if we were going to be going like a day earlier. And then 24 hours later, I'm sitting down at a press conference with Rick Pitino. These are just types of defining moments that you need to have, and that you need to have in this business, because it gives you proper context of how to approach this job and why this is such a coveted thing that we're fortunate to be able to do. We're fortunate to be able to watch this. It's the 5-year anniversary of the world getting shut down for COVID, when that's happening in the middle of conference tournament weekend. And there is no weekend more than that one that made me appreciate college basketball and wanting to be a part of these experiences. And I was really grateful that 13 years ago, someone stepped up and said, hey, we're going to make it happen for you guys. So when I saw Vic Schaefer come out and thank 3 student journalists for driving 16 hours, I was like, hell yeah, man. That's awesome. And it'd be great if student journalists like that across the country got that type of support and that type of love.
Hell yeah. No, I echo that. And one thing is, like, no matter someone's opinion of the media, student journalism is the purest, most beautiful form of that, right? We saw that the big story that the Northwestern student paper broke, that ended, justly ended the career of one of their greatest heroes in that program's history, because he wasn't the guy that, people thought he was. And I think that's the whole point of journalism, specifically student journalism. And so, yeah, I think this is one of my favorite lads or groups of the week for sure.
Yeah. The to be able to like kind of see some of that stuff up close, you can't buy that experience. You just can't. And very, very grateful for my time, and grateful that someone like Vic Schaefer shouted out. All right. Who you got?
Absolutely. So I got a little tiered approach there. Number one, more of a shout out, Nikola Jokic, 30, 20, and 20. Oh my goodness. Got to watch that with the fam in Cali. Amazing performance by Jokic, who just, my family doesn't really watch the NBA. And I'm like, watch this guy. He's built like me, and he looks like a giant baby, and he's about to destroy this team. And that's exactly what he did. So shout out to Jokic. Number two is going to be new mayor of San Francisco, Daniel Lurie. Guys, again, not to wade into the political waters, but no, probably, I know we don't have, a ton of fans of the city of San Francisco probably listening. And I was not like fired up to go to San Francisco because of some of the stuff you hear about the media, but they just elected a new mayor. And buddy, that city is one of the cleanest, most beautiful places I've been. My family who had been there before were shocked at how much it had changed in such a little amount of time. And so I would really recommend, if you guys haven't been to San Fran, now is the time. And we talked to a guy actually at dinner who just happened to be sitting next to us, who I don't know if he knew him, if he was connected, but he kind of went through what Lurie did. And I'm not saying he's a great guy by himself. I don't know his whole story, but I do know that my experience in San Francisco was not only amazing, but very different from what everybody told me, which was very cool. And then I'm going to do overall lad of the week is my stepbrother, Alan Sandlin. What an absolute king, man. The way, he could have given his dad a trip to the Redwoods and they could have had a great time and take a lot of pictures and talked about how it was amazing, but he chose to include me. And I think that's super duper cool. Coming from a family that came together when I was younger, or where I was like a little bit older. I mean, like where I moved to Alabama when I was 14 years old. Alan had lived with me for a minute. It was cool to kind of have those like deeper, like brotherly conversations about, you know, our childhood. We obviously had been through a lot together as adults, but it was more about like, oh, here's the person you didn't know, and getting to have, you know, some of that time, you know, smoking some stogies in the wind, you know, talking about life, talking about, you know, finances and love and you know, the struggles they'd had in their life and how they bounced back. And a time in my life, like I said, that I just faced the first real career tribulation, right, via layoff, seeing two solid dudes. That was so cool. So shout out to Alan. He really didn't have to do that, and he did, and I appreciate him for it.
Talked to Alan last week on the phone.
You sure did.
Yep.
Sure did. And I had to explain to them that we were doing a Diego Pavia thing. And they're the biggest. That's the best part. My whole family outside of my mom are Bama fans, guys. My dad's from Alabama. My stepdad's from Alabama. My whole family are Bama fans. I went to Hoover High School. So this empire of Alabama has just been sucking me into it my whole life and just being like, you didn't beat us in 8 years. And yet that's why I'm so gritty. So that's my answer, is that I'm always surrounded by Bama fans during the Nick Saban era.
Yes. Shout out to your stepbrother, loyal listener of the show as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, greatly appreciated. That will do it. I realize that's a 2-hour pod. Probably not going to be doing too many 2-hour pods. Hopefully this was worth your time.
I'm tired of this pod, Grandpa. That's too dang bad.
If you're looking for pods that are like 40 minutes once a week, that's going to be a little bit tough because we like to cram a lot of good stuff into an episode. And I think we did that today. If you haven't, please leave us a 5-star review. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch every single episode of the Saturday Down South podcast, as well as different segments and different breakout videos that we're doing as well throughout this offseason. Please follow us on Twitter as well, at the STS Pod, at Set Down South, at CJ O'Gara, at Go Smart. Thanks, guys. Talk soon.